I want to welcome everyone to this event, this afternoon, Saturday afternoon event here at SCI-Arc. The symposium entitled Virtual and Immersive Architecture at the Edge of Physicality. This symposium really provides an opportunity to identify, discuss questions, current idea fields and force fields that impact, transition, but maybe most so, position new research practices in architecture and world making. Now, exponential expansion and accessibility of scientific research data, particularly in the field of physics and matter, biochemical and biomechanical processes, operate as active informants to the changing of our awareness and are absorbed and reflected in attempts to continuously reshape, rethink the metaphorical, say, window interface into new territories of knowledge, not only gained longitude, but density, proximity, complexity of dynamic interrelations and increased immersive properties of the work. Now, co-investing, architects, physics researchers, these emerging concepts, architecture has become increasingly fluid. You only need to look at what's happening in our studios here at SCI-Arc, at AA, MIT, Columbia. It seems to get terribly fluid, transforming from, say, time and war-resistant object, increasingly activated, increasingly responsive and intelligent interactive systems with new generations of work pointing towards adaptive, say, self-propagating organisms driven by microprocessor and armed with evolutionary capabilities. Now, work addressing and drawn into this parenthesis necessitates adjustment from a design practice, orchestrating events in time and space, to a practice of interacting and with evolving and generating evolving ecologies. The identifiable trajectory, say the blueprint of this work, of this line of thoughts, faces, and we face and want to discuss today, ties, say, algorithms as finite sequences of instructions to genetic algorithms, evolutionary computation, to engaging with neural systems and artificial intelligence. So what we're going to do today is to discuss the subject. We start off with 4 presentations after giving a short introduction by Ed Keller to Mediascapes. We'll have the 4 presentations by the speaker Ben Bratton, Novak, JoAnn Kuchera-Morin, and Manuel De Landa, who will then be joined in the discussion after presentations by Eric Moss, SCI-Arc Director, and Ed Keller, and including myself. So I'd like to give the word to Ed Keller, and after that I will introduce a little bit in more depth our speakers.
Thanks, Jean-Michel. So I would just like to thank in advance Jean-Michel for coordinating the event, and everyone, of course, for coming to join us, and to SCI-Arc and Eric and Ming for supporting Mediascapes and incubating it over the past year and a half. To give a brief introduction to some of the themes that we're going to look at today, and to Mediascapes, I'd like to start with 2 quotes. The first quote is from the Warner Communications Corporate Report in 1977. With the exponentially increased availability of all forms of communication, the media of entertainment have been pressed into service to provide the individual with models of experience, opportunities for self-recognition, and the ingredients of identity. The movement of information at many rates of speed to many kinds of people is the business of our company, which reflects a marriage of culture and technology unprecedented in history, and a commensurate revolution in the human sense of self. That was Warner Communications corporate report in the 70s. The second quote is from Hans Enzensberger, Constituents of a Theory of the Media, 1969. Every use of the media presupposes manipulation. The most elementary processes in media production, from the choice of the medium itself to shooting, cutting, synchronization, dubbing, right up to the distribution, are all operations carried out on raw material. There is no such thing as unmanipulated writing, filming, broadcasting. The question is therefore not whether the media are manipulated, but who manipulates them. A revolutionary plan should not require the manipulators to disappear. On the contrary, it must make everyone a manipulator. All technical manipulations are potentially dangerous. The manipulation of the media cannot be countered, however, by old or new forms of censorship, but only by direct social control, that is to say, by the mass of the people who will have become productive. Okay, so interesting to me that those two very different opposing political positions, economic positions, seem to be in some kind of resonance with each other. Buildings, landscapes, cities, ecologies, all of these systems have massive amounts of energy and information flowing through them. The ensemble of these systems is the mediascape. Our architecture is simultaneously an extensive and physical system and an intensive and temporal system. We're permeated by a hurricane of increasingly rapid and dense information which flows through us and is accelerated and intensified by the technological advances and the mediatization of the substance of the world. The most urgent goal in design today, then, perhaps, is finding the places where these information and energy systems meet, and understanding how massive technological change, locative media, new forms of global communication, manufacturing, distribution, radical new instruments of economy, which have, of course, failed us quite recently and spectacularly, are creating a world which progresses and advances more rapidly than we can understand and project. So the project of the designer, then, is to attempt, perhaps, to anticipate and theorize these consequences. In his 1996 book, Modernity at Large, Arjun Appadurai uses the term mediascape, and this is where we borrow the term from. His attempt was to situate contemporary geopolitical and cultural questions against the themes of media migration, and define scapes, the term scapes, as fluid arenas for both real and imagined contestation. The imagination, he says, is today a staging ground for action. Terms with the common suffix scape are deeply perspectival constructs, inflected by the historical, linguistic, and political situatedness of different sorts of actors, nation-states, multinationals, diaspora communities, and so forth. So there are two key issues that Appadurai raises that I think make his observations relevant to us as designers. One, there's a systemic change taking place in representational problems and paradigms. Both experts and common folks are visualizing, comprehending, and interacting with tools, landscapes, and systems in a completely different way. The second would be that there are two great variables that drive the production of space, which is, of course, what we're concerned with as designers, media designers, filmmakers, technologists, architects. These two variables would be media, in an expanded form that does include the information flow through culture, through buildings, through all systems, infrastructure, and the migration of billions of people, and the energy and information that these billions carry with them as they are mobilized around the planet. So in the Mediascapes mission statement, I attempted to predict that in 5 years, borrowing from Ray Kurzweil's ideas, between 2007 and 2012, the world would experience greater technological advances than the entire previous 50 years of progress. And the claim that we could make there, potentially, would be that the program would attempt to respond to these massive changes as an academic platform for research and design. So we're 2 years into that 5-year period, and I wonder if we really will see that range of paradigm shift take place by 2012. I would mention a couple of the important changes that are cascading through global design culture, and we can see if, even though that some of them are quite banal, they are indexes of a systemic change as dramatic as the one that I mentioned. We see the end of the recording industry, which was sort of heralded by Napster, but I would argue iTunes, DRM-free media is the turning point, not Napster. We see the end of television, YouTube in 2005 bought by Google 2006. We see the end of newspapers, major newspapers in decline. New York Times perhaps approaching collapse. We see emerging hybrid media. The idea of the folksonomy, a taxonomy created by a group, delicious as a way of cataloging tags and websites that we're browsing, but which is actually an extremely responding and nimble cataloging system like Wikipedia. We see Photosynth, 2006, 2008 public release. Perhaps in the next 3 years we'll generate more 3D data and metadata about images and places in the world than we've ever seen. Google Earth, 2004 acquisition of Keyhole by Google. Last year, Google Earth on the iPhone. I don't know about you folks, but for me, carrying Google Earth around on a phone is still really, really blowing my mind. It's unprecedented, and yet it's completely ordinary. Current TV, all of the kind of emerging hybrid medias, open APIs and mashups, all open source projects, whether they're software developments like processing to sharing of genetic research, real locative media, which uses GPS to identify where people are and network them in both a positive and an extremely sinister way, like Bright Kite, or maybe a less sinister way, like Urban Spoon, just to find dinner. And then perhaps the things that are of close concern to the architects, programmable matter, smart material in buildings and infrastructure, the emergence of the RFID networked object, what Bruce Sterling has called the spine, the space-time object, which is trackable through its entire lifespan. None of these things strike me as being innocent. They're all redolent with a kind of a sinister overtone. And then finally, our current obsessive interaction with scripting and architecture and parameterized design, which can directly link to some of the phenomena that I've been describing. So, cinema provided us a paradigm over the past century. It had the ability to entrain global consciousness, and merge the newly minted hallucinations of the dream machine with flows of capital and culture. This was unprecedented in human history. But I would say much of film theory has labored under the sign of a waning macroscopic model that was used to describe what is actually a much more complex reality. So perhaps we could say then that cinema deserved the title that Hollis Frampton gave it of last machine, precisely because it was one of the last industrial age devices that would have a certain kind of geopolitical centripetal capability. But we live today in a time where the concept of the machine has been revisioned. Machines now can live and think, if not quite yet in human fashion. And the old distinction between the biological and the non-organic has been erased. We can see evidence of novel properties of awareness and self-organization in material systems if we look at the right scale or the right time frame, milliseconds, picoseconds, millennia. Coeval with this revisioning of the complex behavior that we see across organic and non-organic systems is a rethinking of the body politic. Political philosophers like Tony Negri, Reza Negarestani, Eugene Thacker are discovering connections between centuries of political philosophy and the more recent concepts developed by mathematicians like Ilya Prigogine or the non-organic life explored by Manuel De Landa. If we can then say that the machine, when considered from a certain point of view, is alive in some sense, then we can say that perhaps there is yet one more revision of this last machine to take place. Negri's notion of the common finds its maximum expressivity in today's global swarm, billions of people in constant motion and communication, hundreds of millions untracked and unbanked, every day growing more nuanced, savage, wealthy, and dangerous in their capabilities. So there are resonances with Desjardins' concept of the noosphere. I think these are inevitable, but I would contend that the wildly vitalist concept of the non-organic, when tested against older political and practical models of information and energy exchange, the classic ones like the flaneur of the 19th century, or Medvedkin's Cinetrain or Veritov's Quinoa, could lead sooner than we anticipate to a radical global paradigm shift. Perhaps, as people like Kurzweil have predicted, an unregulated singularity culturally, technologically, ontologically. So I began by quoting Enzensberger, who, from a hard left position in the late 60s, argued that giving every individual the capacity to be a producer would yield a kind of radical social and political freedom. But by 2020, I would argue, there will be a cottage industry of DNA sequencing, engineering new organisms, and communication and agency will exist in ways that are utterly unprecedented in human history. Matter itself will become programmable. So we ask, what will the consequences of this fabulous heteroglossic Tower of Babel be? These are some of the issues that we've been dealing with in the first couple of years at Mediascapes, in the studios and the seminars that we've been offered. And these are some of the themes that I anticipate the people presenting today will take up, and certainly I offer them as a challenge and a question for us all as designers.
Thanks, Ed. I'm going to introduce the four speakers.
Could you turn up the PA alone, please? It's very low.
The PA, maybe turn up the volume a bit. Thank you. Okay. The four speakers starting the first presentation by Benjamin Bratton. Is UC San Diego professor, hybrid man, cross-breeding disciplines. His work intersects contemporary social theory operating through multiple cultural contexts and fields. His particular interest lies in sociological human relations of computation in architecture and cities, and the perils and potentials of pervasive computing. I will introduce all four speakers with the statement that sent us in for their talk. His reads, "Pervasive computing will make inanimate objects see, hear, and comment on our interactions with them. This experience will, in many cases, be indistinguishable from a psychotic break or from the rituals of classical animism." I will introduce all four speakers and then hand over. Our next speaker, JoAnn Kuchera-Morin, music composer and prominent founder and director of the Immersive Environment project called Owlsphere Research Laboratory at the Media Arts and Technology Nanosystems Institute in UC Santa Barbara. The MIT lab hosts one of the country's most interesting transdisciplinary graduate program, fusing emergent media, computer science, engineering, electronic music, and digital art. And as you probably know, this semester, SCI-Arc's grad program and the Mediascape studio liaised with the MIT, starting hopefully a long-lasting, inspiring, collaborative exchange. This event today, in fact, is an expression of our joint work, an effort to tackle and explore questions at the storefront of virtual and immersive space. Now, her statement reads, "Pythagoras, the 6th century mathematician and Greek philosopher, is quoted as saying, 'A rock is frozen music in time.' As we enter the 21st century, witnessing the intersection of the virtual and the material, one must think of Pythagoras as a continuum between solid objects as condensed vibration and the vibratory forces that can free these structures into new form. The virtual offers a path to liberation of the material, an avenue that will eventually lead to buildings that will change their shape over time according to their function." Next will be Marcus Novak, real and virtual world architect, educator, and pioneer, best introduced through his own words. He says, "I see myself as a world maker, and my interest is in making the world a rich, interesting, and provocative place. What people do in the world is their own affair. The unusability of these worlds is very much a political statement about the nature of freedom." And his statement for today's talk reads, "Convergence, divergence, transvergence in the face of exponential change. Transvergence is proposed as a tactic of corrective derailment of simple extrapolations into elsewhere, the territory of the allo. Allo, root of the words as else, alternative, alien, signifies the other of the other kind. Therefore, at any given moment in history, and given any set of materially and culturally productive theories and practices, transvergence is an algorithm and a discipline for producing the salient alien." Marcus runs the Transvergence Laboratory at the MIT UC Santa Barbara Institute and is key advisor and contributor to the current SCI-Arc MIT exchange program. And our last presentation of the day before we engage the discussion is by writer and philosopher Manuel De Landa. Initially experimenting with Super 8 and 16mm film arts practice out of New York, Manuel developed a long-lasting affinity with architecture and became a principal figure in new materialism. based on his readings of Deleuze's realist ontology and universal research into morphogenesis. His statement reads, agent-based simulations have become an important research tool in fields from ecology to arcology, and their usefulness in every field increases if, in addition to some form of artificial intelligence and reproductive capacity, say genetic algorithms, simulated agents are also embodied and situated in space. Embodiment implies, at a minimum, that they must satisfy some metabolic requirements to survive, while being situated means that they interact more often with those agents that are nearby and have greater knowledge about their immediate surroundings. Great. We will be ready to start with presentation.
Good afternoon. I'd like to begin first by thanking Jean-Michel and Eric for the invitation to speak to you today at the symposium. The theme of the symposium to me suggests a transformation that arrives as the result of an encounter between related but perhaps irreducibly unlike things: architecture, computation, materiality. Or, alternately, it's an encounter between things that we have improperly assumed were separate, and in this transformation they show themselves to have been always one inside the other. Votes for the first one. Either way, the transformation is an influence, a distortion, an absorption of architecture by computation, of the virtual by the material, with immersion perhaps as a supervising sign. So I want to exercise my prerogative of going first by beginning with what may be something of a corrective. The implicit or explicit association of the digital with the virtual, and of the virtual with the immaterial or unphysical, and conversely the analog with the actual, the material and the physical. And for that matter, the notion that to program computation is to program the virtual is beyond an impasse stage, an end of a branch. We need to busy ourselves with the physicality of computing and the materiality of the virtual and the actuality of the digital and analog as state conditions of the same matter, even architectural matter. So for me, the question of architecture at the edge of physicality is less interesting if it means the physical evaporating through computation into something numinous, but extremely interesting if it means the physicalization, the urban materialization of computational figuration that we used to call virtual. I'm interested in the transformation toward the physical, and that is exactly why I'm interested in computation and architecture. So let me show a little example and to sort of make my point. This is a project called Siftables by MIT Media Lab graduate student named David Merrill. These are simple little objects that contain a screen, simple computing capacity, motion sensors, proximity sensors. They work very much like regular physical objects in the world might work, except that they have the capacity to communicate and transmit information and intention through their use and to each other. Now, if you imagine scaling something like the siftable blocks, a much more complex version of them, as something that's, say, the size of a truck, or of a building, or of a city block, then some interesting possibilities may emerge. But for any such version of something like this to work, some kind of standard interoperability of components would be necessary. In the von Neumann computer architecture, which we all know and love, that interoperability is called the operating system, the OS. We would need, and what we see emerging is an urban OS. An OS that allows the meta-computational field of the physical city to support and be programmed in whatever way developers, software developers that is, not real estate developers, support. An effective precedent model of the urban OS perhaps is then the grid, a simple, inflexible protocol that has enabled the flourishing of the modern form, which we might call provisionally the Turing city. So let's match that against another history, that of computation, or more specifically software. Software's history falls within both a genealogy of technologies, albeit one that is constructed about linguistic and grammatical forms, and a genealogy of languages, albeit one with explicitly technological effects. Now, calculating machines are ancient. Here is the remains of the Antikythera mechanism from 100 BC. Symbolic logics and calculus were later formalized by Leibniz and Boole centuries later, but it was not until the 20th century that the two were properly interlaced, the calculating machine and symbolic calculus by Alan Turing. The Turing machine was a theoretical device, a hypothetical universal machine that could calculate eventually any technical problem that could be reduced to a formal equation. Instead of specialized machines for specialized problems, the Turing machine could calculate anything, the last technology. The only limit in principle is the possibility of program being coded in essence into software. Turing, of course, had the opportunity to develop a practical model on behalf of the British, the bomb, a giant brute of a thing that calculated the supposedly unbreakable code of the Nazi Enigma machines and contributed substantially to the Allied victory. Now, computational ontologies have a deep and varied history, including perhaps even Lucretius and Leibniz, if you want to extend the definition sufficiently. Among the signal breakthroughs include Alonzo Church's contributions to lambda calculus and the computation and the computability of recursive and non-recursive functions from 1934. Stephen Keen's pairing of Church's contributions with Turing's image of theoretically infinite computation and expressed as the Church-Turing thesis in 1952. Banks and later Wolfram's work on cellular automata. Others, Konrad Zuse, John Wheeler in particular, have extended the implications of theoretical physics. One potential implication is that the universe itself is a hypercomputer of sorts, which does or does not, depending on your perspective, allow for the harnessing of non-recursive functions and the deliberate counter-computation of matter itself, such that atoms might be understood as bits within a universal digital field. If atoms are bits, and bits are computable, then atoms are computable as well. Or rather, they always were and always have been so. If that is the case, then the computational operations of the city are once again a condition to be identified, activated, discovered, designed, and designated, not simply installed and invented. Computers, are even very powerful ones, are then just machines that are good at simple computing tasks, but they are not computation. Like light bulbs are machines for simple electrical currents, but they are not electricity. In a parallel register, Alain Badiou has developed a mathematical philosophy of being and event that also privileges the infinite divisibility of discrete matter and instances from monadic analog continuities of particles and waves. Badiou's critique of Deleuze hinges on this very principle, and in positioning Deleuze as a romantic Bergsonian who, despite employing a language of radical multiplicity, actually rests on an infinite oneness of things. Matter not as bits and numbers, but as an unbroken Spinozian wave formation, such that beneath the multiplicity of singularities is the infinite singularity that embodies the multiple. Now, especially on a panel with Manuel, I have no interest in defending Badiou's critique, but wish to include it so as to emphasize that philosophies bound to a pixelated ontology provide different ways to conceive and appropriate the world as a mathematical computational field. Further, Badiou's own work on the philosophy of mathematics and the substantialization of the number and the numeral would clearly distance him rather severely from the commonplace ideologies of digital capitalism and information flow, which he explicitly sees as an obfuscation of the political philosophical implications of the mathematical condition of the event. Now, within architecture per se, it's of course the work of our friend and colleague Carl Chu, who has dedicated himself most intensely to these issues and their implications for what architecture is and does. Summarized brutally, we can say that for Carl, atoms very much are bits, and that bits may as well be atoms. as well, is such that the formal mechanical pursuit of formal complexity represents not a model of human habitation, but a direct design of the real as a horizon of informational immanence. Post-Church Turing, architecture has a much more ambitious set of building blocks with which to work. He writes, quote, "Architects take note. This is the beginning of the demise, if not the displacement, of the reign of anthropology which has assumed architecture. The potential emancipation of architecture from anthropology is already affording us to think for the first time a new kind of xeno-architecture with its own autonomy and will to be." Carl's eloquent sentences are not constructed with the manifesto's typical facility and with exclamation points, but they may as well be. My quibble is not so much with the exploration of a meta-computational epistemologies of matter and design, it should be clear by now, but with the insistence that this represents something alien and transcendental from the world we inhabit and perceive. A netherworld of Gnostic solipsism filled with beings of pure light and data. If the computational ontological thesis is true, then it tells us that information is matter, is physical, is bodily, and not that it is not. The Gnosticisms to be avoided, that matter is a deterioration of spirit, that the universe is a collapsed deprivation of the deity, and that the pursuit of the core of things is an overcoming of the grossness of matter. Quite to the contrary. Now, to be sure, a designer does not have to take a position on whether recursive and non-recursive functions exhaust the procedural capacities of a theoretical Turing machine in order to see the city in computational terms. Otherwise, I'm sure most would have headed for the door long ago. The figure of the city as a massively distributed computer appears contemporary with the computer itself. And before this, the network city is well understood by the Romans, the informational city by the French and the pneumatic tube engineers who largely perfected the point-to-point packet switch distribution of analog information units. By the 1960s, continental-scale computational network systems such as the SAGE early warning system suggested more comprehensive transformation of urban pathways and partitions according to information processing perspectives, and especially in cinema and architecture. A short and scattered list might include Godard's Alphaville, Alpha Soissons computer overseeing a future Paris in 1965, Dennis Crompton's Computer City with Archigram, also 1965, John McHale's 2000 Plus in 1967, Archigram's No Stop City, all part of a milieu popularized by Marshall McLuhan's publication of Understanding Media in 1964, which made the redefinition of the city into a landscape of smart networks, information, prostheses, a cocktail party commonplace. That figure of the city, less a vast industrial machine than an unfolding collective sensory apparatus, couched many of the important cinematic projects of the time, from Stan Van Der Beek's intermedia experiments to Gene Youngblood's expanded cinema, exploring the architectural potential of cinema as a material and the urban environment as a cinematic surface. I would argue that in the core perspective of the city as an informational sensorium, that the figure of the cinematic city and the computational city did, even in the 1960s, cooperate if not explicitly converge. That this configuration would bring with it a new possibility of open and improvisational social forms, made and unmade and remade on the go, implies a central importance for the organizing logics of interfaciality as well. So in this, we think of interaction, interfaciality as a point of triangulation between cinema, computation, and itself, of its own interfaciality. Now, by interfaciality, I mean simply the quality of an object that has come to be an interface. A button is a flat piece of metal or plastic, but once placed in a larger system, an elevator panel or a keyboard, it takes on an interfacial capacity of sorting, transforms, and vicarious causality. Interfaciality is bound up then with causality itself, a philosophical problem that has met with a significant range of opinions, Aristotle, Ernst Mach, Herbert Simon, Lacan. Likewise, whether an object contains as an intensive or extensive property the property of causation, and how much of that is a foreign relational imposition, how vicarious is the cause, remains, at least since Heidegger, a persistent problem in the philosophy of the thing. Among Maurice Merleau-Ponty's most lasting meditations is on the co-evolution of human technological and environmental embodiments. Our bodies have come to be as they are, not only because the world has selected for certain body diagrams and body diagram options, but because we have remade the world with technology before we were human, and this re-technologized world, of which we are partially responsible, has in turn selected for the bodies best equipped for it. In at least this regard, interfaciality, like computation, is not at base a new condition brought by modernity, but an integral component of experience revealed in a more radical form by modernity. As others have explored at length, interfaciality not only describes the broad conditions of embodiment, but the more tactical and nuanced constructions of self and subjectivity. An interface is, among other things, a cognitive array of possible options and events, through which and against which an individual or collective position is located and enacted. One conjunction of particular interest for architecture, then, is that between interfaciality and computation. What happens to computation when its affordances are staged as interfaces? And what happens to interfaces when their causal layers are computationally intensified and amplified? What happens is the second half of the 20th century. What also happens is a new opening up of the city. New aspects of the city become available to perception, to potential interfaciality, and thereby to a design imaginary. And such interfacialities likewise empower the users of cities to redesign them on the fly. For example, electromagnetic fields exist just about everywhere in our atmosphere. Urban locations, in particular, have a diverse and vibrant Hertzian culture, with mobile phones, calls, overlapping text messages, combining television broadcasts with garage door openers that interfere with radio transmissions with wireless laptops, etc. Not to mention the natural electromagnetic fields that already exist in the atmosphere. This project, SCI-Arc by Usman Haq, is a spatial investigation of some of these phenomena. SCI-Arc is a non-rigid carbon fiber cloud embedded with 1,000 glowing helium balloons and several dozen mobile phones. The balloons contain miniature sensor circuits that respond to electromagnetic fields, particularly those of mobile phones. When activated, the sensor circuits coordinate to cause ultra-bright colored LEDs to illuminate. The 30-meter cloud glows and flickers brightly as it floats across the sky. Not to produce a new realm, then, of pure mind and bits, but to organize and activate layers and channels of physical space that we otherwise were unable to perceive or manipulate in ways that now make them social and communicative. Just as radio waves were there before radios, the computational spectrum was also always there, and we are now learning to compose and calculate with it. Turing's proposition was of a universal machine, a machine that could calculate any problem that was in fact calculable. And to the extent that any mechanical problem could be described as calculable, it could be inscribed into an executable grammar of software. Perhaps a Turing city would also be defined as one that can universally modulate any habitational program or operation, and to the extent that it can be defined both as an architectural and software program. The Turing city, then, is the city that is equally universal, relational, recombinant, and reprogrammable. Not a generic city, not a super modern city in the Eveling sense that is really not a city at all, but a city that is in fact reprogrammable. Not a generic city, but an infinity city. Not non-place, but all place. It would be a condition that can be remade again depending on something approximating an urban OS or an ecology of OSs, which would function analogously to the modern grid. Now, when I think of this, I don't think of robotic walls, but of everyday objects. Human societies have co-evolved in correspondence or conflict with the tangible objects to which we assign significance and meaning. We don't only live in a world of things, we inhabit a world of things with which we have assigned characterization. Around this, Theodore Lipps developed a theory of objective empathy that strongly influenced Neutr's theory of material, for example. For Freud, Durkheim, Levi-Strauss, this characterization is a totemic process, and also one of transubstantiation, such as of the Eucharist, bread and wine. of meager things into divine characters. Things, formally or informally, contain the human memories we have attached to them. As Ben Servany says, all around us are shards of other people's attentions, of other people's experiences. The horizon of pervasive computing makes this field of memory into a formal language. These objects gather metadata as they receive attention and form more complex structures based on the relationship caused by this metadata. Servany and his studio Stamen Design, as well as a new company started with Kevin Slavin of Area Code to develop located media-based gaming platforms, qualified this field of object connectivity as constituting a new horizon of situation to be programmed and gamed, explicitly along the lines of the situationist model of unitary urbanism. But who controls these objects, and how should they work with us and for us as communications medium? They could be awful one-way broadcast channels blaring urban spam, scary surveillance tools for tracking the body politic in real time, and/or they could be, as they need to be, truly open and public. Adam Greenfield has a nice riff on this. Public objects. All public objects should be open. What's a public object? A sidewalk, a building facade, a parking meter, any discrete object in the common spatial domain, intended for the use and enjoyment of the general public. Any artifact located in or bounding upon public rights of way. Any discrete object which is de facto shared by and accessible to the public, regardless of its ownership or original intention. Yes and yes. It's a nice synthesis of ideas, I think, in the air, including Osman Hawk's extended environmental market language. But the whole city is a public meta-object, and openness isn't just about software. Openness and publicity has to be a hardware issue as well. Architecture, streets, zoning, the whole thing. An open API for a closed city is nothing. Osman Hawk's extended environmental markup language it structures the city as a human system, but it's also one part of a regional and global ecology, producing and absorbing heat and energy as a living, breathing entity of concrete, glass, and steel. It does this whether we know it or not, register it, name it, count it, or legislate it. But what if we could see these flows, adjudicate them as part of a parliament of things, and redesign their interrelationships? If writing is a way to rename, recaption, remark, reterritorialize the surfaces of the city, then Hawk's extended environmental markup language is a truly urban writing. By using a standard markup language protocol similar to the ones that describe discrete bits of information on a web page, we can overwrite the urban landscape, integrating the full potential range of interest, attentions, and descriptions provided to the formal memory territory. Twitter Plant by Botanicals extends the process of seeing and monitoring the non-human participants in that urban ecology, particularly non-human organic systems, into this adjudicable information parliament of things. The project simply is a moisture sensor within a plant that, when the plant gets dry enough, it sends you a message on Twitter telling you to water. But aren't we? Okay. 12 minutes. All right. Yeah, I'll finish it. Okay, let me go to the end. You mind if we do the last paragraph? Okay. All right. Information visualization transformed from active diagrams to active interfaces is a necessary move for the realization of anything properly approximating immersion. We move from a situation of a cybernetic model of computation, structuring a city, which as a mode of government structures a population of people, to a model, as Ed suggested, of people using models of computation to restructure the city in the images of their intentions. By immersion, I do not mean that, as others may today, the direct prostheticization of embodied senses by means of artificial perception. This is very interesting stuff, but I'm more interested in what we could call augmentation of the perceived city than in wholesale simulation. The projects I've shown then are based on the integration, or rather the activation, of a secondary data layer into or onto the mobile and habitation of urban spaces. Two interlaced channels or spectrum are brought into direct contact with each other, one we perceive on our own, and one through forms of collective technological mediation. Think of the experience of talking on a phone. You are here standing in front of us physically. You see us and we see you, but you are also somewhere else in conversation with another person transmitted as a voice only you can hear. Two spaces for you are folded into one. The same may be true wearing headphones or writing email on your laptop when you sit in an audience at a symposium. We are used to multitasking modern split or folded spaces. The Turing City will, it seemed to me, amplify such folds and scale them into central, less exceptional conditions of place, location, and embodiment. But instead of one channel partially overriding one sense, like hearing, we may learn to manage the partial override, the augmentation of all senses at once, allowing us not only to see electromagnetic fields, radio waves, biochemical processes, distant social networks, but to participate and redesign them as a course of everyday life. A synesthesiac mixing of sensory information allows one to pilot another, sight interfacing touch, sound interfacing proximity, touch interfacing magnetic fields. In this, the general principle of interfaciality becomes even more important. Even more naturalized and even more empowering to the extent that it allows for the open, controllable, politicized perception of multiple layers and topologies of potential information. The interface becomes both a mode of urbanism in its most optimistic and generous sense of the term, and a contestable condition of social language, communication, even, one strongly hopes, poetics. Thank you.
The mic's activated, by the way.
Yes, it's working. Again, thanks all of you for being here, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak to you about what I consider transformative technologies in our artwork and our content. I'm a composer, which is interesting for me to be here talking with architects. But I came across the same dilemmas very early on in the 80s that I think are opposing the architectural area now. I was an orchestrally trained composer, so I'm not a virtual composer. And I was reaching problems with my materials. I was coming to dilemmas. For instance, my cellist, when my cellist was on stage, I wanted the cello to turn into the Taj Mahal and engulf the audience. And I simply couldn't do that with that art material. I didn't want to leave my materials because I am a content person. And yet and again, I wanted to express these very important transformations. And that's really when I saw the importance of marrying the virtual world with the real material world. A way to be able to actually take the mathematical constructs, and some of us have talked about the mathematical constructs. This is really the underpinnings there. And actually really transform from the material into places that you really cannot go, and do it mathematically precisely. I knew from my acoustics research, I had the coordinates of the Taj Mahal, I had the coordinates of the inside of a cello, but I couldn't make the physical body of the device change over time. But by putting together the material world with the virtual world, I was able to apply the precise mathematical constructs to make that move. That was really exciting to me. I was starting to develop my vocabulary, my grammar as a composer, and push myself off into other worlds. That was really important. We started then adding on the visual domain, really looking at the mathematical constructs of transformation between audio data and visual data. And all of a sudden I found myself moving from the material world into the virtual world, which was interesting to me because I'm a technophobe. However, here I was. I was poised with a problem here that I had to see through. As I started working, and the more we started to transform this data, I realized we really needed an instrument that would allow us to work between the material and between the virtual. And as I was pushing on into the virtual, I noticed a sense that I wanted to go back to the material again. I needed to work with real things, real physicalities. And yet again, I didn't want to go back to the material world of fixed objects, of structures that once they were made, they were fixed. We talked about some interesting things Jean-Michel mentioned. Transformation, mathematical constructs. It's interesting at the biological level, at the classical world of that math, we're fixed. We can't control that biology at the macro level. We're stuck with our material. We can put the material together, but we can't transform it from the atomic level. Now this led me to an interesting dilemma and led me right to working with my materials researchers, my materials scientists. And so over a 24-year period, and being at UC Santa Barbara, we've built a digital media center within the California Nanosystems Institute for the precise reason of getting back to materials research and being able to actually build new materials from the atomic level that will grow and unfold over time. Now this gives very interesting constructs to architecture and the future of what we can do when we start looking at these mathematical constructs that may right now be applied virtually, but I think very soon are going to be applied physically. In my building right now on the first floor, I have material scientists growing new materials, coming up with new material bonds, and I'm going to show you some of this information once I finish speaking, and I'll try to be brief when we go through a video and we actually see the instrument. So this was really exciting to us, and we're actually in a building that's going from the polymer to the application. We're working together, our media artist colleagues, our program that I developed in the late 90s and was able to bring aboard some really interesting colleagues, like my colleague Novak sitting next to me, brings music, visual arts, computer science, and electrical engineering together. And we consider ourselves a representational portal, but we're working with scientists that are asking very important, very curious questions at the subatomic level. And for me as an artist, that's exactly where I want to be. I want to understand the nature of who and what I am, the nature of what this information is in the universe. And yes, I don't believe there is a disconnection from the visible, the invisible, and the immaterial to the material. I think that it is, matter is condensed vibration that actually becomes stilled. So this is really interesting concepts and constructs that we're going forward. And so as a result of the 25 years, I built this instrument at Santa Barbara. This is a big scientific and artistic instrument. It's a 3-story metal sphere in a near to anechoic chamber, an echo-free chamber. This is a big digital, dynamically varying digital microscope that we're going to hook up to a supercomputer. And we're going to be able to interactively control and tune in any space in the world through the proper mathematical constructs. So this means a philosophy of what our compositional constructs, what our artistic constructs are, is important to unfold. So as we build the instrument, we must build the grammar that's going to hold the instrument together. So content drives technology. No piece of technology should be used without using it first, and then breaking it and rebuilding it over and over again. And this is how we're approaching the Digital Media Center and the Allosphere in the California Nanosystems Institute. So before I show you the video that talks about the research projects that we're doing, that are actually defining the mathematical constructs in our research groups to give us this philosophy of working from the atomic level and going all the way up, or working from the biological level and going down into the organic data. Let me show you some of these mathematical constructs we're talking about, and some of the research projects that we're going to show you that involve my PhD research group, some of them are here today, and my colleagues in the Media Arts and Technology program and myself. But this continuum, as I said, between solid objects and condensed vibration deals with some very important mathematical constructs. I'm working with Nobel laureates in the Institute for Theoretical Physics, people that are working with particle quantum wave equations to really understand the ideas of structural binding, a structural flow of information. So these research areas are important with material transformation, the wave equation, particle wave interaction, I'm going to show you an artistic installation which is near and dear to my heart because it will be the next piece that I write, even though much of the work is done by my PhD Lansing Putnam, that is a hydrogen atom, the time-dependent Schrodinger equation that will show you an electron in superposition. You'll actually be able to hear it going through the orbital paths. What does this mean for me as a composer? This means now I have a mathematical construct that will not only tell me time and frequency, but spatial coordinates. Albeit because of the Heisenberg principle of uncertainty, they won't tell me exact spatial coordinates, but I don't need exact spatial coordinates. I just need to know where the sweet spots are in the material so I can combine the sounds together in the way that I want to. So we'll show you that project. We'll show you another project that deals with electronic spin, actually quantum information flow. We actually took the real measurements from an electronic, from a quantum dot, and made a synthesizer out of it, visualized it and sonified it so that we could play these information patterns and start to see these complex quantum information flow. It's pretty interesting. It's just catching the tip of the iceberg on that one. The next one I'd like to show you is structural materials research, and they won't go in this order necessarily. But this is very interesting because we're working with our materials researchers that are coming up for new materials for information technology systems. This material that I'm going to fly here is a 2,000 atom lattice that's going to be a transparent liquid paint that you can spray on your windows that will make a new solar cell that will light up 100-story office buildings. And to actually be at the level of the atom, to sculpt the structure from the micro level up, from the nano level up, from the spin level up, is where we can really free ourselves in the architectural world. First, it will be through the virtual domain, but it will then come through the physical domain by working with our materials researchers. Some of the last things I want to show you are working from the bio world down, and one is actually the real fMRI data of my colleague Marcos Novak's brain. Will fly through that data. We're getting biological data constructs from that so that we can make biogenetic algorithms and actually unfold our own ecosystems. So now you see this idea of bio-nano generation of new materials, particle quantum information flow, particle wave force, and I think all these constructs are going to be really important in all of our fields as we go forward. So let me show you the video really quick. It's a 6-minute video. I'll kind of narrate through it and then I will be done. Okay, I'll start it for you. And I'm going to probably read because it's going to be playing as I go through it. Let's see. Okay, and it's going to start playing, so I'm going to just start talking right now. So what we're going to do is you're going to come up upon the actual facility. I believe it's playing. Am I playing? Yes, I am. Okay, I have a 20-second lag time. But we're coming into the campus. So this is the California Nanosystems Institute that you're coming into. You'll see the building, Ealing's Hall. And we're going to do a virtual fly-through into the 3-story instrument. Okay, here it is, right in the corner of the building. I think of the whole building as a big supercomputer. This is the terminal interface. You fly right into the 2nd floor. You're on a bridge. 20 researchers can be suspended in this 3-story ball. This is going to be 360-degree projection of visual data, audio data, and we can stand in n-dimensional fields of information. So you can imagine, for instance, and you're going to see some of these coming up as we go through this, a team of researchers flying through electron spin, and that's exactly what we have here. Or a team of researchers flying through atoms, sculpting new materials. Or a team of researchers flying through a brain in order to find new worlds, to look at this as a new transformative landscape and to try to find new data sets. So these are the types of research that we're doing. We think they make gorgeous artistic installations. They're helping us get our compositional constructs together. And so now I'm going to take you through these 5 research projects, and I'm going to move, actually, I'm probably going to go ahead and read about these projects as we go through this. Our first project that we're going to fly into is actually the AlloBrain project that I was talking to you about. The AlloBrain project, and you're going to see as soon as we get through this little curious amoeba, we're going to fly into the Marcos's brain. It's true fMRI data. This was conceived by Marcos and our PhD group. It attempts to quantify beauty by determining which regions of the brain are the most active when witnessing something beautiful. We're flying through the cortex of the brain. Our narrative here is a literal visual and sonic mapping of the data from an fMRI machine The brain now a world through which we can navigate. 12 intelligent computer programs, agents, the colored rectangles on the screen fly through the brain with us, data mining the blood density levels, and they report them back to you sonically. So these agents are actually singing the blood density levels. Higher densities, higher pitches, lower densities, lower pitches. One can imagine the new worlds one can uncover artistically as well as architecturally by exploring regions one cannot typically go to. And this is mathematically exactly precise. Our neurosurgeons fly through this data set, find a lot of information out of this data. We're now going to move from real biological data to biogenerative algorithms that create artificial nature. In this artistic and scientific installation by two of my PhDs, biogenerative algorithms facilitate our understanding of self-organization and growth, important areas of research in the nanoscale sciences. For the arts, these biogenerative algorithms generate new worlds for us to explore artistically. The algorithms begin a sonic communication and interaction as the swarm of insects in real nature. They're communicating as they feed one another. Researchers interact with this world in real time, generating bacterial code that literally feeds the insects as they grow over time. As we move now from the macroscopic level, we're going to move down into the world of atoms by flying through a new materials compound for clean technology. This is from my colleague JoAnn Kuchera-Morin, who invented the blue LED, Thomas Edison of the future. They've just discovered a new bond, the multi-center hydrogen bond. This is Professor Chris Vanderval's research. You see right in the middle that little pink structure, one white hydrogen atom bonding with 4 zinc atoms. Those arrows are showing you the first order derivatives to the non-time dependent Schrödinger equation, how structural bonding occurs among the electrons. It makes a gorgeous artistic installation, and it's helping us really understand the structural underpinnings of new materials and new researchers. The music that you hear is actually the emission spectrums of the atoms. This is true mathematical constants. We drop them down 27 octaves in the light domain into the sonic domain. Oxygen always has the same sound. Now we go down to one single atom. This is a hydrogen atom. This is the mathematical constructs by my physicists in the Kavli Institute of Theoretical Physics. This is hydrogen with the electron in superpositions of very orbital states. What you're seeing right now, the bubbles or the probability wave, the Heisenberg principle of uncertainty, showing you where this electron could be in the lower 3 orbitals of the atom. These lines are the velocity flux of the electron. When the lines get thick, that's probably where the electron is at that instantiation of time. We're going to move on to another configuration here. You see the pulsing? This is with the orbital and the electron in 2 orbitals, which would emit a photon. So this is a light emitter. My physicist colleagues are finding new patterns in information. They're determined to map Hilbert space in the ionosphere. We have an instrument powerful enough to do that, and we've got the mathematical constructs to go forward. And look at the gorgeous art in space. This is going to be my next piece. It probably will take me another 15 years, too many to go through this. I'm going to take you into one final project, and this is to Electron Spin. This is real information from a quantum dot. This is 3 lasers. They're tipping it into a quantum state. When you hear that wow, that's tipping that quantum bit into superposition. So you start to see all these patterns. These are all quantum information flow that's dealing with n-dimensional details of the Schrödinger equation. You can see why we have to get in there, why we actually have to have the whole ionosphere lit up so that we can actually be inside that dot and we can see the information as it flows. So this is a little bit of the research that we're doing at the CNSI and at the Digital Media Center, bringing arts, science, and engineering together, really moving from the material world, because I'm an instrumentation person, into the virtual world because of our need to use the computational system, but back to the material world in new ways that we can now sculpt from the ground floor up, and materials need not be fixed anymore if we can break this code at the spin level and at the nano level. Thank you.
good. Can you hear me? It's there. Oh, great. Well, it's very good to be here, and in particular, in this context, of course, SCI-Arc, and thank everybody for making this possible, and Mediascapes, and this particular topic, and in this particular group, and in between JoAnn and Manuel. All of it is very auspicious and wonderful. It's also intriguing because the first time I was invited to speak at SCI-Arc was in 1996. And I spoke about something, I looked this up because I couldn't remember. I spoke about the body cyborg avatar continuum. And sorry, I'm trying to coordinate a few things and get going so we can keep at least 12 minutes. And it was a strange time. I think those were things that the school had yet to embrace. I mean, they had embraced them enough to invite me, but not embraced them enough to jump into the deep end of things. Many things have happened since, so it's really interesting to be here and to try to connect that period to the topic and to the future. So let me multitask here for a second. Before I start, I'm going to be going through several things very quickly because we don't have much time. I want to say a couple of things. One, to start off with a definition having to do with architecture that I happily got by one of, or from a late night email from one of our PhD students, Wes Smith, who I don't think is here.
He's there.
Is he there? Who sent everyone on our list Etienne Boulet's essay on architecture and art. Which, of course, is really intriguing because the group that we're talking about, the people that you saw this work from, are people who have all worked with me in a set of courses called Transvergence that was mentioned, and also in my trans lab, and who are not necessarily architects or even initially people who made visual or spatial things, but more people from other backgrounds, especially mostly music. Although we range pretty widely. So it was interesting to receive a treatise on architecture from this group. And so it starts off, what is architecture? Shall I join Vitruvius in defining it as the art of building? Indeed, no, for there is a flagrant error in this definition. Vitruvius mistakes the effect for the cause. In order to execute, it is first necessary to conceive. Our earliest ancestors built their huts only when they had a picture of them in their minds. It is this product of the mind, this process of creation, that constitutes architecture, and which can consequently be defined as, the definition of architecture now, as the art of designing and bringing to perfection any building whatsoever. Thus, the art of construction is merely an auxiliary art, which, in our opinion, could appropriately be called the scientific side of architecture. Art, in the true sense of the word, and science, these, we believe, have their place in architecture. So, the reason I'm starting with a definition of architecture like this is because I want to frame the discussion as something to do with all seriousness about what architecture is to become in the 21st century, and to state unequivocally that we are not born contemporary, we become contemporary. Just being born today doesn't make you contemporary, and so it's an ongoing effort and question about what it is that would make us so. Okay, another comment of this order, the word allo that you saw in the allo brain and in the allosphere is a word that signifies the other of another kind. Not the other as we are all other, because we're all human, but the other as the other and the alien, which is derived from this word. And the idea of putting allo in front of the allosphere or the allo brain or various things is to focus this device onto the stars. because it doesn't make any sense to invent a telescope, like Galileo did, and point it at your shoes. You will see blurry shoes. You have to point it at something else. Okay, now, first a movie. If you came to the Venice Biennale last fall, you would have seen an installation of mine called Turbulent Apologies. I'll show you a minute of it here, where this cube contains an invisible sculpture, invisible architecture made by sensors. The real topic is this emptiness. The screen represents the virtual. In front here are objects that are built that I'll show you that are the physical. And actually, in the initial installation that began in Istanbul, behind the screen was a fabrication machine that made new pieces from the interaction of people. The installation actually watches people with a camera, interacts with them, produces new works. That's all hard to believe, perhaps, but if you come up to Santa Barbara, as many of you have, you'll be able to see it. So let me make sure my sound is up. Okay. So the important part here is the invisible part. What space does. The ticking sounds that you hear, and the marks that are left in space, are actually my interactions with a specific architectural shape whose shadow or mirror image is what you actually see. The form is actually present in space in a very palpable way that you basically have to experience to understand. Now, I don't want to spend more time on this again, okay? So I want to very quickly show you some images of the physical pieces, just to frame the conversation, and then I want to switch modes completely. Okay, so these are pieces that are made by gathering the data from the interaction and giving them actual tangible form, which could then be as we wish it. And they make a kind of constellation of objects. And the important thing is to register that they exist in virtual space, in interactive space, in tangible space, but more importantly, in the continuum of the three. Now, forgive the hurry, these minutes are counting. Now, what happened between '96 when I was here and now, is that when I had come here for that talk, I had just finished the paper called Transmitting Architecture. And that paper did reasonably well, as such things do. It showed up in many places, was quoted, published, et cetera, et cetera. It spoke about this curious idea that architecture had come to the point of being transmitted. Last summer, I was invited to be one of the plenary speakers at the 23rd World Congress of the International Institute of Architects, whose world theme was transmitting architecture. So in the course of 13 years, a fringe idea that was basically unspeakable had become actually the topic of the World Congress of Architecture. This is an inframing kind of comment, because these things can become hard to believe, and so it's good to be reminded of them. Okay, so what I want to do in the time, just to make sure that I do this quickly, is I want to read the update to that paper, not the paper from 1995, but where we are now and how it pertains actually to the theme of this edge of physicality. And to put that very concisely, there is really no edge to physicality, because there is nothing but physicality. Because even if we were to discover the universe is 10-dimensional or 20-dimensional, those dimensions would be discovered by physics, and they would be inside the physical. there might be a contention about mass, and therefore it might be a question of how we might build architecture out of less mass, including just plain light, as you just saw. But I'll jump into this reading, and I'll try to push buttons as I go. The images, I would normally show you hundreds of them. I'll disassociate. I'll be reading and just pushing the button and resist commenting on the images unless I'm absolutely compelled to. So, Transmitting Architecture Revisited. When I wrote Transmitting Architecture, the Transphysical City in 1995, the consideration of architecture as something that could be transmitted, literally, not just metaphorically, was quite unheard of. The essay proposed that the transmission of architecture needed to be seen as the next step in the evolution of the mediated transmission of meaning, beginning with sign, symbol, text, sound, image, and moving image into all aspects of lived-in architecture: space, place, form, shape, structure, inhabitation, urban ecosystem, and so on. But also as abstract and dimensional information structure, allogenetic code, and mechanism for the morphogenetic development, and that this transformation itself and the changed sense of space that it implied needed to be understood as an inherently architectonic problem and opportunity. At this time, putting the word transmitting next to the word architecture was madness itself, just like phrasing liquid architectures had been before it. And yet, like liquid architectures, it was a prescient idea. Over the intervening years, as evidence has mounted that this conjunction is necessary, and in fact is indeed the case, whether we as architects or as citizens choose to see it or ignore it, the influence of this idea has continued to grow. Until now, 13 years later, it has arrived as the theme of a major World Congress of Architecture, organized by one of its most august bodies, the UIA, counting, as the ubiquitous Wikipedia tells us, over a million members in 113 countries. Transmission accomplished. From zero. My interest in pointing out this connection between the UIA World Congress in Turin and my 1995 essay is not primarily historical, at least not in a narrow sense. The argument of the essay remains relevant to this day. Its propositions remain strong and valid, and there is much to discuss that has yet to unfold, and many ideas in it that will take years to unravel. It is being republished, it has already been republished, on the occasion of this World Congress, and the reader is urged to read it as it stands. In the spirit of the original essay itself, my preoccupation is with the future and how we make it happen by pushing strongly against the present. And my motivation is to take this opportunity to propel the essay forward into the next few decades. What might be added to what the essay argues for? The title of the essay, Transmitting Architecture, was prescient. The essay's equally prescient reference to futurism also bears noting. It is remarkable that the essay anticipates such a connection, and that indeed, that the World Congress of the UIA has taken place in Turin, the place where in 1910, futurism was launched. Milano complains about this, they think it's this year. The claim of the essay is that we are living through changes that make the changes the futurists were reacting to seem as if moving in slow motion. This was evident well before 1995 and is only more plainly visible today and must be taken even more seriously today. It is in the nature of exponential change that we will always tend to underestimate it. To do so is a perilous mistake. The optimism of the futurists was followed by 2 world wars, and even they did not foresee. Global warming is the global warning that by extrapolating linearly in the face of exponential change, we wait too long and react too weakly. This was true 100 years ago and is far more true today. As Marinetti, whom the essay quotes, stated, we must learn to distrust our antiquated linear thinking and improve our eyesight when it comes to anticipating the future. Quote from Marinetti, here and there, sick lamplight through window glass taught us to distrust the deceitful mathematics of our perishing eyes. Zero now. Often, in the not-so-linear history of culture, a solution is invented before a problem is recognized. When the essay was written, the most easily understandable context for transmitting architecture was that of telepresence and the inhabitation of virtual environments. At that time, virtuality was intriguing, as it will continue to be for a long time to come. Now, however, with the growing recognition of globalization and global warming, the two sides of the same vast coin, and the calculation of the carbon footprint of manufacture and transport and everything else besides, transmitting architecture has become a global imperative demanding a global architectural response. New steps. How has the world changed in the 13 years that have elapsed between the original publication of Transmitting Architecture in 1995 and the UIA Congress of 2008? For some answers, we can look to the high end, to the global state of our knowledge, or to the low end, our global vernacular experience, or to the bridge between the two, our global technological basis. The conclusions are remarkably congruent. In 1995, the World Wide Web was still a novelty. Now it is the scaffold and map for nearly all our undertakings. The global positioning system was then nascent and is now prevalent. The Human Genome Project was a beginning, not an accomplishment. fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, had not yet allowed us to map the workings of the brain. There were no rovers on Mars, no Cassini-Huygens spacecraft orbiting Saturn. There were no Google, Wikipedia, YouTube, no truly widespread social networks, no dominant markets for downloadable media, no online worlds. There had been no revolution in computer-controlled fabrication, no trans-architecture symposia and exhibitions, no Archilab, no non-standard architecture events. The computers with which we connected to everything did not yet fit into the palms of our hands. Telephones did not have GPS chips and 3D graphics, accelerators and accelerometers and cameras. The dispersal of inhabitation into a fine-grained powder was a theoretical possibility, not a lived fact. These things have now all come to pass. At the same time, while the world's information is now more interconnected than ever before, we are more disconnected and held wider apart by alienation and fear and terror. And yet, even these ancient enemies advanced in their use of transmission. Friend and foe alike issue their messages over the same networks, employ similar strategies, employ techniques of asymmetry, indirection, and dispersal. Pilotless drones, robot warriors, and smart weapons constantly transmit, receive, and coordinate updated information about the space they are in. Sadly, they are more effective at intercommunicating than many of the networks we have to deal with disease, disaster, oppression, poverty, and starvation. As Paul Virilio once pointed out to me, I am an optimist. I believe that in the face of undeniable problems, creative optimism is an ethical responsibility. Those of us who enjoy the gifts of freedom and talent must strive to end our criticisms and complaints with assertions and proposals for how to improve the world. In preparing this short update to the essay, I reviewed all the Nobel Prizes that had been awarded between 1995 and 2009, as well as many other such epistemological registers. To begin with, in 1995, the Nobel Prize for Medicine was shared among the researchers upon whose work molecular and developmental genetics now stands. That same year, 1995, the Nobel Prize for Chemistry went to researchers studying ozone depletion as a result of chlorofluorocarbons. A year later, in 1996, the Chemistry Nobel Prize went to the discovery of Buckminster fullerene. Year by year, distinct patterns become clearly visible. The environment and global warming, molecular biology and nanotechnology, developmental biology, neurophysiology and magnetic resonance imaging, superconductivity, conducting polymers and new materials, the economics of globalization and asymmetrical information, the physics of neutrinos or the Big Bang. These are the topics that form our collective advances of how we know the world. The plasticity of the world is clearer to us now, and we are making rapid strides in exercising our control over it at fundamental levels. The scope is breathtaking, but it all hinges on a simple principle: our control of the very small. Designing the very small means designing the very many, which in turn requires massive coordination, communication, and feedback. In other words, the means for transmitting architecture, not only as static shape or outcome, but especially as a fine-grained active mechanism and dynamic principle. Transmitting architecture has evolved. If in 1995 it was understood to mean using artificial algorithms to create artificial worlds, in 2008 it means making use of the natural algorithms that are already acting directly on the world. Paul-Ray's chain reaction, for instance, being smarter, more balanced, more flexible, and more robust. It means being ecosystematic in harnessing processes that already exist and learning how to become more powerful by being less forceful. It means that what is to be transmitted must be more like a request for proposals and collaborations among peers than like an ultimatum issued between unequals. Morphogenetic development, and you're seeing some of this on here, the many processes by which we go from being a single cell to becoming a complex organism, is still the supreme example for what we need to accomplish. DNA transmits our architecture, but not like a message shouted into the void. A balanced internal ecosystem is already presupposed, the ribosome. And the message itself is given like in waves of chemotactic gradients, sequenced in space and time like a musical organization of qualities, whose interference patterns literally form our limbs and organs, our brains and minds and thoughts. How to operate this way is what we need to learn, both for our practices and for our understanding of what the material world is capable of providing for us. Transmitting architecture in 2009 is an alloy of message, mind, and material. It is a step toward building an n-dimensional, transvergent, and transmodal continuum that is self-assembling and self-calibrating, an artificial life form that is both organism and environment, and that spans the inner and the outer, the actual and the virtual, the visible and the invisible. I call this transvergence and speciation. Friedrich Kiesler called this correalism and spoke of the endless house. But his drawings clearly trace the connections between inner and outer worlds and show that he meant much more than fashionable curved shapes. But by whichever name one chooses, the intuition is the same. Everything is connected, everything is communicating, everything is transmitting, and everything is receiving, even when it is not listening. Allobio, my project for the 2004 Venice Biennale, called for an architecture that is grown, not built. Allobrain, my project for the UCSB Allosphere, consists of virtual environments created using fMRI data of my own brain in action. Turbulent Apologies, my current exhibition in Istanbul, Venice, Valencia, Korea, it's going all over the place, also in Santa Barbara, contains both transmitted fabricated pieces and a large invisible architecture of visible sculpture. Work that is created using motion tracking technologies and that updates my previous work in Vienna, Orléans, the Venice Biennale of 2000, the installation of the Palazzo delle Papese in Siena, and many others. These are not, I'm finishing. These are not separate projects. They are the methodical building of this transvergent and transmissible living architecture. Little by little, the pieces are falling into place. In the end, there is no hard difference between nature and artifice. All nature is mechanism, artifice of a very high order. And all human artifice is as natural as it is for us to be human. The difference is one of degree. Unlike us, nature has infinite resources and infinite patience. We are children in its playground. We have much to learn. Now, the only other things I'm going to say, and I know I'm finishing, Jean-Michel, is this, that I spoke at the World Congress, I spoke right after Peter Eisenman. I'll stop that. Right after Peter Eisenman. And Peter, who was one of the people I admire and admired as a student and invited to my talks when I first started teaching and has had a tremendous influence on me, was there describing the difference between late periods and early periods, saying that this was no longer an early period, this was a late period. And he was talking about Beethoven and Beethoven's late quartets. And that gave me the proper way to begin my talk at the World Congress and to end this talk here, which is simply this, to Peter and to everyone here. It's never too late to be early. Thank you.
Can I hear you? Hello, everyone. I just want to make a very simple and few points about some very focused themes. In particular, I want to talk about two types of simulations. I'm going to try to relate them to architecture wherever I can, but it's not necessarily about architecture. The first type of simulations that I've always been fascinated with, at least since the 70s when they took off, is simulations of biological evolution. Biological evolution is obviously a very creative process, and it can be considered a search process, a search in the space of possible vertebrates, a search in the space of possible insects, a search in the space of possible mollusks. And given our experience of all the different species that evolution has found in this search, we can believe that it is in fact a highly efficient searching process. Now, of course, evolution doesn't have foresight. Evolution operates only with whatever is immediately at hand. Evolution is opportunistic. So it is not a search with a goal. It is not as if evolution had been, for instance, searching for human beings, and finally we are like the crowning jewel in the evolutionary process. Evolution stumbled upon us. We are here by chance. Nevertheless, even though evolution is blind, or at least short-sighted, because the entire population that constitutes a reproductive community for a particular species is searching a space of possibilities at once, as a kind of cloud that moves through this space of possibilities, it is a highly effective search process. So when computer scientists began to use evolutionary ideas in a computer virtual reality domain, one of the main things they wanted to do was precisely to harness these search capabilities. Remember that search algorithms, search procedures in computer science are extremely important, not only because you can become a gillionaire if you come up with the right search algorithm for the internet, but also because just about everything you do in a computer implies searching your hard disk for either space, for the files that you have there, and so on. So search algorithms are very important in computer science, and when they realized that evolution is a search process, they decided to try to use it, to harness it, to find things in space of possibilities. Now, the simplest implementation of evolution is called the genetic algorithm. It was invented by John Holland in the 1960s. Although it didn't receive a name, I think it was his students in the 1970s who finally gave it that name. The chromosome, remember that evolution, what it needs, the basic formula for evolution is that it needs a population, always a population, not Adam and Eve, right? It's always got to be a reproductive community, a population of variable replicators. Meaning they need to be able to replicate, to pass that information from one generation to the next, and they need to pass that information with errors. They need to pass that information, or at least with random recombination, as in sex. Because if the replication was perfect, then there would not be any evolution. Then all you need to do is couple that population of variable replicators with any kind of filter, any kind of sorting device, anything that biases the process in favor of some replicators and against other replicators, and you have yourself evolution. The filters in nature are, of course, predators, parasites. In the case of certain animals with nervous systems, with evolved, with elaborate nervous systems, it can be a mate choice. But there can be, in other words, a whole variety of filters, a whole variety of biasing factors. But the formula for evolution is, in fact, quite simple. And as you just hear, when I say any population of variable replicators coupled to any filter results in a parallel search process, I'm not even mentioning genes. Although genes are, of course, one of the best examples of variable replicators. But the fact that the formula doesn't mention genes means that evolution may be instantiated in a whole variety of ways. Now, including, of course, computer programs. You can have computer programs that by whatever means can replicate themselves. If you can apply operators for mutation and sexual recombination to those computer programs, and if you add some kind of a filter, then you can have evolution in the computer. Now, outside of the computer, we can have two types of filters. As I said, it can either be climate, predators, parasites, or other natural factors, or in the case of human breeders, like dog breeders and racehorse breeders, it can be humans themselves, humans making the choice at every time their animals mate, who to let mate with who, so that it's kind of form of directed evolution. So you can have either evolution in which the filters are other animals, other species, or other physical factors part of an ecosystem, or evolution in which the filter is a human being. Well, the same thing applies to genetic algorithms. In the genetic algorithms are the simplest form. The replicators are basically strings of ones and zeros, that is bit strings. That's the simplest possible way of getting some kind of a chromosome to replicate. They are not self-replicatable. They replicate. There's another part of the program that allows the replication, although self-replicating programs had existed for a long time. And the trick to use it in architecture or to use it in art is learn how to code whatever you want your phenotype, whatever you want your body to be, whether you want the body to be a painting, whether you want the body to be a piece of music, whether you want the body to be a building, a way of coding that building, that piece of music, that painting, into those ones and zeros that constitute the chromosome. Now that's a tough part, because of course ones and zeros are just a bunch of numbers, and so you need to basically have a numerical coding of what is in fact perhaps a very complex form. But for instance, think of in architecture that if you had already reduced the problem that you're trying to solve to a problem of parametric design, and you have now, say, 10 parameters that you can, all of which have, of course, numerical values, and you have 10 parameters controlling whatever forms are generated. Well, that is the perfect example of how to apply a genetic algorithm. The genetic algorithm is all it's going to do for you is search the space of possible combinations of parameters. That space you can actually search it by hand, but it's going to take you forever, particularly if you have 10 parameters. So all you do, imagine that your parameters, each one has, say, 64 values. Well, you take the binary expression of 64, which is a series of ones and zeros, and you take those ones and zeros, they represent the first parameter, then you take another string of ones and zeros that represent the second parameter, the third parameter, the fourth parameter, the fifth parameter, all the way to the 10th parameter, and now you have your chromosome. Then you make a population of those chromosomes, and you unleash them in your computer to evolve. All they're going to do is explore that space that you already predetermined, but nevertheless, they're going to do a better job than you could do, because you're going to get bored with exploring all the possible combinations. You're probably not going to do an exhaustive search of all the different corners of the space. And what the computer then is doing, or what the genetic algorithm is doing, is becoming a kind of visualization tool, or a kind of search tool, a kind of search that doesn't get bored. That's the simplest possible way of applying a genetic algorithm. Now, if you want to get more out of evolution when you're doing your architectural designs, then you need to switch to genetic programming. Genetic programming using a more elaborate type of chromosomes. The chromosomes are not just bit strings. They are not just a series of ones and zeros. They're actually computer programs. But they are computer programs that can be expressed in a particular type of language called the lambda calculus. No relationship. And it's the Greek letter lambda, by the way. And in the lambda calculus, you can take a complex tree-shaped decision tree and replace the branchings of the tree by parentheses, so you can really end up with a chromosome that looks like a string of molecules, just like DNA is, except that now it's a program. It does things. With genetic programming, and the person that you should read if you want to study this, his name is John Koza, K-O-Z-A. He has 4 volumes of fantastic stuff. The guy has been able to find, using genetic programming, new designs for electrical circuits, new designs for antennas, new designs for a whole variety of engineering devices. So it is just a matter of time before this is applied to architecture. So you increase the richness of the chromosome, you increase the richness of the potential results. Now, in most applications of genetic algorithms and genetic programming, the assumption is that there is a human breeder controlling the process. In other words, there are no other species exerting selection pressures on one another, there are no mates making choices, there's no climate inside the computer. In other words, the chromosomes are entirely disembodied. And that's okay as long as all you want to do is search a space of possibilities. But if you want to go beyond that, if you want to really recreate some kind of ecosystem in the computer, and so that you can be surprised as to what comes out, then you need to embody your chromosomes. You need to get rid of the dog breeder. So the easiest way of doing that is replacing the human breeder, which of course is not a human breeder, it's something called the fitness function. It's a mathematical function in which the human has specified what bias, the fitness function is the filter that I was talking to you about, what is going to kind of direct evolution one way or another, because it's a human who writes a fitness function. It is acting as a breeder, despite the fact that there's not a human there checking every generation. You have to get rid of the fitness function. You have to make success within the ecosystem itself the criterion for fitness. Because the fitness function is an evaluation of who is more fit, who is less fit, but it's an evaluation that is done or performed on the basis of a fixed criterion that doesn't change throughout that evolutionary process. So the easiest way of getting rid of the breeder and making real evolution is to give that chromosome a body. It's embodiment. And this is something that is becoming more and more important in genetic algorithm and genetic programming research. And the easiest way to giving them a body, they don't have to have like fancy shapes, they don't have to have any kind of, it is basically giving them a metabolism. That is forcing them to look for food, in other words, creating a space in which food or some kind of virtual food or virtual resources are distributed in that space, allowing the bodies of the organisms that carry the chromosome to move around that space, to find food and feed on that food, and then make their reproductive success, that is their fitness, depend on how much food they're found. Or if you want to put it in a different way, establish a minimum of food that they have to eat before they can reproduce. Because if they're going to have offspring, they're going to have to feed their offspring. So you can always say, well, they have to accumulate a certain amount of food in addition to the one they have to metabolize to continue moving and searching for more food before they can reproduce and create offspring. That very simple move, which gets rid of the fitness function, creates an entirely different space. Because now what grows and evolves within the computer, although it is less useful for design, because the designer now has less of a say as to what forms will come out. The designer can have a lot of a say if the designer establishes the fitness function, but once the fitness function is out, then what evolves is what evolves. But if what you want to be is surprised by the kinds of forms that emerge, this is the best way to do it. So once you put together a metabolism and a chromosome, you have a true virtual creature, a true virtual animal, which is of course more like a bacterium than any kind of real animal. But nevertheless, bacteria, remember, dominated the world for 2 billion years. It was not until the Cambrian explosion, that famous moment where all the multicellular organisms began to diversify, that multicellular organisms like ourselves had a chance to finally begin populating the Earth. So microorganisms not only preceded us and dominated this planet for 2 billion years, they still dominate this planet. I mean, we are immersed in a soup of microorganisms. Every single one of our orifices, and every single one of our tubes, whether our esophagus, whether our intestine, and I don't want to gross you out. I'm too late. Is populated and colonized by microorganisms. We cannot get rid of these little things. It doesn't matter what we do. So they are still around, and it is still their planet. They are just using us as new ecosystems that have evolved and where they can now create their own little communities. So it's not as if they had preceded us and then we had superseded them as higher forms of evolution, because once we nuke ourselves out of this planet or pollute ourselves out of this planet, those microorganisms are going to inherit it and are going to continue their lives just as they did before. At any rate, to have virtual bacteria inside a computer by giving them metabolism and by giving them a chromosome is already the first step of creating actual, true artificial life, and to really try to get formed to emerge within those reproductive communities entirely on their own, without breeders. Now, if we want to take the next step to say insect life, we already need to assume that there's some kind of multicellularity, and that those, in other words, that organisms have more than one cell, and that some of those cells have now have differentiated. So for instance, some of those cells have become neurons, some other cells have become the walls or the structural elements of the bone or muscle or something like that. Of course, insects don't have that, but they have a kind of exoskeleton, which is also cellular. So let's assume that insects have something like 50 different types of cells. Well, we need to assume that multicellularity has already created this diversification, and that creates a more complex computer problem. Nevertheless, it can be done. Let's stick to something very simple, to something that we may call proto-insects. And let's assume that they only have 2 types of cells. The cells that compose their bodies, they need to be embodied, and the cells that act as nervous systems. Now, the best simulations of the nervous systems that we have so far is called neural nets. It's the connectionist school of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, because it was born in the 20th century, a century that was entirely obsessed with language, a century that was in fact an entirely waste of time in the humanities, if you ask me. Not that you're asking me, but just in case you well. Wow. I'm almost done. I'm almost done. I actually couldn't even see the numbers, man. How about that? Because
No, the language.
oh, okay. Because the 20th century was entirely obsessed with language. Of course, artificial intelligence began as symbolic artificial intelligence. It was based on logic, it was based on symbols, it was based on explicit rules that manipulate explicit representations. And for a while, there was even a political fight between those connectionist guys who wanted to do away with representations and do away with logic and try to mimic what neurons do, because inside our brains, there are no representations. Inside our brains, everything happens through activation and inhibition. Everything happens through complex, self-organizing processes having to do with intensities. Whether you inhibit those intensities or you excite those intensities. It's a matter of distributions of intensities and the patterns those intensities form. It's information, but it's information in Shannon's sense. Remember that Shannon invented the concept of information, or the word information as it exists in information technology has nothing to do with the word information as when we use it when we say, I get my information from the newspaper, or I get my information from CNN. That information is linguistic information. But Shannon had no access to linguistic information because when he invented his theory, he was working for the Army in World War II on how to send coded messages through telegraphs that were already scrambled and in fact disguised as noise. So he couldn't have any access to the semantic content of that. All he needed to do is make sure that that random looking thing arrived in the same random looking form on the other side when it would be decoded. So information in Shannon's sense, and in the sense in which it's used in information technology, is pattern. That's all. Self-organized, emergent pattern. And connectionists try to follow on that tradition. They were stopped for a while by a book called The Perceptron, written by two symbolic artificial intelligence people who sabotaged them for about 15 years. So there's a politics of science, there's a politics of budget. I am finished. I'm the only one who got hit with this, by the way. Can you please man your station there, because I'm going to be queuing you right now to put the animation in.
Do you have to switch to the mic?
Am I too loud or something? Hello? Okay, I'm going to wind down. Now, neural nets, this is the way neural nets work, okay? They have nothing to do with symbols, nothing to do with language. They simply match one pattern to another pattern. They work with patterns. Complex neural nets act like the nervous system. They not only match one pattern to another, they actually extract prototypes from patterns. So therefore create in an emergent way proto-concepts, the kinds of concepts that animals must have, because animals don't have language. But the animation that I'm going to show you in a second is actually used with the simplest possible neural nets with only 2 layers, which match one type of pattern to another type of pattern. Now, what Carl Sims, the artist who created the simulation, did was to create insects, or very simple insects, in which a neural net was placed on every articulation of the bodies of these insects. As you will see, he did not bother to try to get the body, he did not bother to create fancy nerves-based bodies for the insects because, you know, I'm going to cue you to do that, man. Hello, can you stop at that for a second? Yeah, please, thank you. I know you're anxious to show it because you're... Yeah, it doesn't make sense until I finish explaining what it is, okay? Neural nets on every articulation, and he kept them boxy on purpose because what matters is what emerges spontaneously. The neural nets were connected, of course, to a genetic algorithm. But most importantly, they were situated in space. Not only they had a body that had, for instance, in this case, they were submerged in virtual water, because unless you are situated in space that presents you or affords you opportunities and risks, or unless you are in space that you can affect and be affected by, then evolution is extremely limited. So the genius of Carl Sims in this simulation was not only to, for the first time, or one of the first times, link neural nets to genetic algorithms, but to place these creatures in an environment that afforded them opportunities and risks. Now, before I run the animation, I want to say that what you're going to see is about the 6,000 generation. The first little creatures that he dropped into his virtual water couldn't do anything. They would probably just like limping along the bottom of the sea, you know. Some of them couldn't probably even move. They were just going like that. But he picked in every generation the ones that moved the most And after 6 generations, they began to develop all kinds of gates, all kinds of propulsion mechanisms entirely on their own. Oh, can you run the simulation now? There's one crazy little creature. That's a much more realistic one. Because now that looks like a real animal that could have come from the Cambrian explosion. They are propelling themselves correctly. That's one that doesn't really use anything that we would recognize as real. Can you run it from the beginning again, Jean-Michel? Because we're now in land right now, and these are the least interesting ones. See, this one has a couple of flippers. That one went flipper a little too crazy. Some of the movements are not very natural, but you can see that they could have evolved. Some of the movements are more natural, and I believe we already saw this is one of the most beautiful ones, the snake type of movement. And now you can stop it so I can just finish the talk. The point I was trying to make is that you get the most interesting result. Well, there's 2 points that I want to try to make. First of all, these types of simulations are becoming recombinable building blocks. The genetic algorithm was invented by one person, neural nets were invented by another person, but now artists can come in and start putting them together as recombinable building blocks. The second point I was trying to make is that unless you are a scientist who's trying to prove theorems about the things that you are developing, the best results, the more dramatic results you're going to get is by embodying, by giving a certain body to your creatures, by giving them a metabolism, by giving them a reason to live and a reason to reproduce. And of course, by situating them in a space that has the capacity to affect them, and that they have a capacity to affect. In this case, the water has a certain viscosity that resists movement, but they have a capacity to use that viscosity to propel themselves with those flippers. If he had not put them in that water, then they would have never evolved anything. Every single animal in this planet evolved surrounded by affordances, surrounded by opportunities and risks that could guide that evolution. And the final point I wanted to make is this. When scientists use these simulations, they always try to stick to the simplest possible examples. And that, I'm not saying this as a put down. I'm saying it just as part of a career track type of thing. You use the simplest examples so that then you can prove formal truths, theorems about them, and you can publish them, and you can be part of the scientific community. Which means that it is artists that are going to be pushing the envelope when it comes to this simulation. Because artists, the very last thing they want to do is prove a theorem about anything. What they want is to create drama. What they want is to get both genetic algorithms, neural nets, multi-agent systems, cellular automata, whatever genre of simulation we're talking about, push it to the limits, push it to the most dramatic, push it to the most expressive. So I believe that we are close to enter a new kind of renaissance, a second renaissance that was sort of like the one in the 15th and 16th centuries, in which artists were half scientists, half artists, but in which they were the ones, because they care about sensuality, they care about expressivity, they care about drama, they were the ones that were presenting us the side of science that is most expressive and ultimately most interesting. Thank you very much.
I think we want to try to engage a conversation about this though really expansive and complex field that is impacting our work. I think I've tried to view it from the side of the public, of the students, of the makers that are trying to extrapolate, identify particularities that become directly deduced to their work. The discussion is going to be joined by Eric Moss, and I'm also happy to announce that Neil Leach has joined Brighton, London, and is currently visiting LA, has been teaching at SCI-Arc on other occasions, and hopefully will join the discussion. Eric, would you like to join us up here?
I can't. I have to leave.
If you get the mic, maybe you'd like to.
Do I?
To be honest, this reminds me of one of Peter Nover's trips to Havana and listening to Castro. There's an old line in architecture: you have to learn to burn what you love, and it's hard to see whether any of the panelists are prepared to burn anything. The other thing is, for a quotation initiative, I think it was Bernard Shaw who said every profession is a conspiracy against the public. And present company accepted, of course. And you present your work collectively. It's impossible to put your arms around this and to say what was said, because there were so many different things and so many presumptions of language, of definition, of point of view, which are so arguable, which are simply handed out as a city is a computer. Evolution. City a computer. What does that mean? No idea. Could mean any number of things. Evolution. I mean, there's so many discussions about evolution. We're talking about natural selection. We're talking about rocks hitting the Yucatan. Mammoth was the toughest animal ever to make it on Earth. Gone. Toughest animal. So evolution has luck. Evolution has dice. Evolution. New York Times is collapsing. Good, bad, indifferent, replaced by Wikipedia. So nobody knows. Buildings will change their shape over time. Good. The Louvre used to be somebody's house. Now it's a museum. Didn't change its shape. The cello and the Taj Mahal. Really? What the hell does that mean? Good subject. Good subject. Every cello and the Taj Mahal. Rat-a-tat-tat. And I'm a composer. Not Stravinsky. Not Cage. So the music of the spheres, it's kind of, but might be a topic, but it's certainly not self-explanatory. None of it is self-explanatory. We had an interesting guy in here last night who was a sort of antiquarian who runs the AA, a guy named Brett Steele, who was here to talk about what a thesis is, how to make a premise, develop an argument, define whatever history is, lineages, whether they're legit or whether they're invented, all of that. And I think what's difficult for all the intelligence up there is to follow any kind of discourse which sees itself as obligated to make a case rather than just assert things that are so. And we should all pay attention to this. Nobody knew whether that, you got very irritated because it ran the animation too soon. And nobody in the room can tell you why. I'm willing to bet. Nobody knew. And okay, but this is if you're presenting a thesis or a hypothesis or the way it is or the way it was or the way it might be or the way it should be or the way it will be, then tell us why that's so. Nobody did that. So there's a lot of information floating around up here. There's a lot of allegiances. Information. What information? Who said what to whom? How valid, how useful? We're all connected. We are? And somebody said we're all connected. In the next sentence he said, and the connectivity is productive or it's destructive. I think it's so many loose ends that it's hard to synthesize any of this. To me, it would have been a much more productive discussion to set up some essential definitions, some essential premises, and I know it's not the Manchester Guardian, but if we would make use of the USA Today pro forma, which is no jumps, headline, subhead, couple of paragraphs. I believe this works, this doesn't work, this is where we're going, this is where we should be going, and discourse. I think that's what we want. I think what we got are 5 or 6 allegiances that have some overlap, that have some affiliations, and not enough, not very little critical, intellectual, self-suspicion, zero, I think. And I think this makes it very difficult to come away applauding, except to say, what happened? What happened? What do we know now we didn't know 2 hours ago?
Really thought you were going to get that 12-minute presentation.
Insular, these, I thought it's up to you. I don't think it's so much the time, I think it's more the content. But my experience with these things, you put 5 architects in a room and you give them 5 minutes and they talk for a half an hour, and in the end, it's about each individual. I don't want to debate that so much. You guys set it up and you ran it. But I think what's useful to the audience is the intersection of a series of opinions that are different in certain ways and overlap in other ways, and it's not clear how they're different or why they're different or how the differences matter or substantial. So what do we know that we didn't know 2 hours ago? You tell me.
Einstein said at some point that we should try to make our laws regarding physics as simple as possible and no simpler. So it might be that what you're saying is true, but it might be that there's simply a lot going on that needs to be assimilated very quickly, which is part of our predicament. So
well,
it might just not
depends who you're talking to.
I'm referring to Einstein.
Yeah, I know, but I've never spoken to Einstein.
But I've spoken to several, Nobel Prize winners. We have colleagues.
Congratulations. But some of it has something to do with an interest in a discourse. And if what you're saying is
you're impugning a disinterest in a discourse, which of course I can't accept because that's not true.
Well, you don't have
you
to
may not,
accept
you may not find
maybe you're just too
sophisticated.
Maybe you're too sophisticated for me.
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say I am who I am. I don't need to say it one way or another.
Yeah, but this is a school, and these are ideas, and they're accessible.
You should ask the audience about ideas. Did anyone hear any ideas here? No?
Everyone agrees with this, that no one understood anything and no one got anything out of
I
it?
don't think that's what I said.
That's roughly what you just said.
I don't think that's what I said.
Yes,
we see
that's what you
hands.
just said.
There are hands who have seen and heard ideas. I think, would you raise your hands if you saw and heard
Some
ideas?
people, look around. Look around.
This is not a vote. I'm just giving an opinion.
Opinion based on ignorance.
I think, Eric, you know what I think you wanted to hear, which I think would be a good thing to do right now, is to really try to synthesize some of these things that we talked about. Where do we see commonalities among what we talked about? Where are the differences? I mean, I think that you're right. I mean, there's been a lot of information from disparate groups, and we didn't come together and organize. We didn't have time. But this would be a good time to look across what are some of the topics that we talked about in here, and where do you see some synergies? Where do you
I agree
see
with you.
some?
All I wanted to say is I think that this requires some definitions, and that everyone may not share a priority on whether the city is a computer or the times is gone or evolution is evolution in a Darwinian sense is a means to understand design conception in an architectural sense. It's an interesting syllogism. It hasn't been proven.
That's right.
It was just asserted.
Absolutely.
First of all, I did not assert that term.
And I think it would be easier, even basic terminology, computer, city.
I did not say what you just said, I said.
Okay, but I don't know, I don't want to turn it into a single point.
Well, you started, you are antagonizing us from moment one. Without having understood most of what was said here, you're pretending you can now speak for everybody in this place.
No. There are
Why
six
don't you pass the
people.
microphone to other people so they can ask us real questions?
There are six people in the symposium. Everybody spoke for about 20 minutes. I spoke for 2.
Well,
2 is too much for
not
you?
really. Not really. It's about 15 minutes.
Yeah, fine. So I'm now about 15 behind you, female.
Well, pass it to the people. Pass it to the people.
It's your show,
This is an
baby.
interesting conversation.
Boss.
Well, you're leading into the breach, Nathan. I enjoyed it. But I think what was interesting, Eric did make an important point there, and that is about definitions. And I think, having all your platform together, what I got the impression of was not a single voice, but more a kind of a range of disparate voices. I was at the AA once, they brought computerized and they read Crettaz together, and they sort of described them as though they were kind of similar people writing and doing similar buildings. And when you put them together, you realize how different they were. And I got the impression from this, once we all knew together, how different your positions were. And Marcus was this sounding here?
Sounding funny.
Yeah, you said that you're
It's probably a bit too far from the
Okay, it's better. Marcus was presenting something about, a story about something he'd said in 1996 or written about, and how it's come true now. Which is kind of interesting because at the same time, Manuel was talking about the shift that had happened in the 20th century, 21st century. And I wanted to maybe pick up on that, the shift between the kind of world of representation of symbols to a world of materials and processes, something that I'm very much conscious of. And I'm wondering how this is mapped out in terms of architectural culture, in terms of the approach towards computation. I think when we started out, initially back in the 1990s, there was a kind of romantic, almost science fiction discourse about neuromancers, about cyborgs, about sort of virtual realities in a very romantic way. And suddenly, Manuel's at the conference I organized in London in 2001, it was eFutures. There was kind of a reality checkpoint when we suddenly began to realize that all the sort of utopian aspirations we had for computation were being challenged by the reality of the situation, and how much of that domain had been appropriated by capitalism in its world of spam. It wasn't a world of kind of artistic, subversive, whatever it was. They'd been appropriated by commerce. And the comment that Douglas Rushkoff made at the time was really, it was up to us to really understand this world, to get real, and to find out how it's working, and to use it for the benefit of humanity. And I think what I've seen in terms of architecture has been an incredible shift whereby it's become I mean, there's still people working in a kind of, let's say, science fiction way. I mean, Hernan works very much in that sort of way, but it's become a kind of everyday reality in our offices, to the point that the buildings in Beijing, they could not have been built without the use of digital project or without the use of scripting and things. And what had been a very utopian science fiction world has become a kind of hardcore reality today. And that's the shift that I've seen. And I think the question I've now got is really, my biggest problem was the use of the term virtual in the title of this conference. I mean, I find it a very difficult term to deal with. I never use it myself. It seems to speak, when I only use virtual, when I talk about the virtual in the world of Deleuze, and it seems to me that kind of maybe one needs to try and find a different terminology. There was certainly a slippage in the way that the term was used. It was the virtual versus the material, and a series of rather competing terms. So from that point of view, I think Eric is correct to ask a question about the terminology being used, and how do we, what terms do we use? Manuel was talking about simulation, which I think is actually quite a useful term. He was looking at how we use the computation for the search engine. Benjamin was talking about how computation was not just digital, it was also material, how the city was a kind of form of material computation. So there are a series of terms that are kind of out there. I think there are a series of different positions, from quite artistic, kind of romantic views of things to kind of hardcore, kind of scientific positions. And I think that what I saw today was really kind of a range of that, and an interesting range. And I ended up thinking, by putting yourself all together around a table, I ended up seeing the differences between people here. I don't know whether there's a response to that. I think, Benjamin, you and Manuel sort of had quite a different position to, I thought, yeah, you two together, I think, had a slightly different position to the musicians and the artists, I thought. But I want to leave that with you, whether you yourselves saw a kind of a unison or a kind of more fractured sort of outlook on the digital domain.
I'll just jump in for 1 second, but then I wanted to ask Ben to expand on something, because it seems that on the one hand, a theme that runs through everything is a recognition that computation is an important model, that it can be extended to a number of different scales through a number of different systems. And then it's very important to understand what you mean when you say computation is something that you can talk about by looking at a city and saying the city is computational, or you can do, as Manuel pointed out, you can attempt to recapitulate an entire history of a foundational theory for computation, ending up with a punchline that articulates some kind of value in it, which is connected to evolution. So I think that there was a thread across a number of the presentations like that in JoAnn's and Marcus's, pointing more specifically at the interfaciality question that Ben had brought up. And so from my point of view, honestly, the term Mediascapes is opportunistically borrowed from Opaderai, who loads it with a tremendous amount of importance and meaning as a conceptual tool to understand systems in the world, which could then, of course, be understood computationally or not. For me, the Mediascape is a system that's about information flow, and the points where information connects from one system to the next system. So when Ben was bringing up the issue of interfaciality, I actually thought that there were two questions there that came up. One was just purely a technical question, which was addressed in his presentation on a number of levels. But there was a deeper question in relationship to causality, which I thought I would ask him to address in light of some of the, if you will, terms of art that perhaps we may not have communicated adequately to the audience.
In terms of art?
In terms of art. In terms of art specific to computation, or specific to media theory, or specific to philosophy.
All right. Well, there's a few different questions in there. I'll try to circumnavigate them a little bit. Let me just sort of start with a couple points of clarification. Then for some Eric's my proposition, I think, was sort of clear, that it was not that the city is a computer in the sense of this, but rather that I think it's impossible not to understand urban processes separate from computational processes as they already exist. Our interest is less one in an imposition or a smearing of computational capacities over the surface of the city like some kind of butter, but rather an activation of those processes and conditions that already that already exist in one way or another. Now, let me speak to the question of the artist, because I think this is sort of interesting. I don't know that it was necessarily my disagreement sort of first with Manuel about this, but I think that there is a problem with the way in which the artist is positioned within media art and technology art in general, and perhaps specifically in terms of some of the things that we've seen today. And I think it does have to do with the notion of the Renaissance, of an idea of the artist as essentially someone who works in relationship to scientists, relationship to technologists, and whose primary job is to produce conditions of beauty, to aestheticize technology, to enroll us in the possibilities of beauty, and the way and use beauty essentially as a kind of alibi to enter into the production of a scientific truth. And I think the question of interfaciality, I'm not entirely sure exactly where you'd like me to sort of enter the question here, but I think the important thing to sort of that I would want to sort of differentiate, I think, is the difference between the cybernetic models of the 60s and 70s that were interested in the computer as a kind of city, but where one was particularly around a control system of the city as a singular entity, the operations and flows of information within the city as a continuous field of information that could be designed and controlled from a central position, in that way in which the causality of the control mechanism was a form of centralized governance. To me, the real question, I think, in terms of looking at urban systems in terms of computational procedures, does have everything to do with the condition of governance. But it's not a governance, I think, in terms of the process between central institutions, representational institutions like parliamentary system, but one in which the activity of living in the city, of working through the city, of coming in contact with the processes and procedures that comprise that city, in itself becomes a form of real-time governance, and the process of habitation of the city comes to take on the capacity of having a force of law that can be extended in that way.
No, actually, that is connected. I think we should run it one time back across the table and then maybe ask for more questions from the audience. Yeah. That does address one of the issues that I was interested in, but Marcos and JoAnn were talking specifically about the interfaces that they were working with. And the importance of that for me is the fact that they're demonstrating an interface which gives access to data flow in a way that, one, historically we haven't had access to, and two, is, in my opinion, inextricably connected to the models of that data flow, or the ways that we think about information in general, which, of course, was underscored by Manuel when he was invoking Shannon. And so that's one connection in terms of interfaciality. The other connection ultimately does go back to the question of what kind of agency is present, because you had actually mentioned a number of times in your discussion an idea of agency, or if I rephrase it, the capacity for causation. Objects containing intensive and extensive capacity for causation, which of course goes back to the question of whether things are capable of perceiving and acting, whether humans, constituents in a society, are capable of perceiving and or acting, and most importantly, what the theory or the model is that we have for that interaction capability, that capacity to affect and the capacity to be effective, which a number of people have actually have raised tonight.
Well, yeah, and just the way in which the way in which that effect can be repeated in essence institutionalized. Because I think at the end of the day, I think what we need to be, let me just say this very quickly and I'll pass along to Mike. We have to think of this, I think, less in terms of art and more in terms of design. And that the work that we're doing here and the work that we're conceptualizing has to be something that can be repeated, that can be enforced, and we can take on the capacities of an institutional material culture.
I think it's interesting and quite instructive to observe the reaction we received and the tenor of the conversation, and to wonder what's really at stake. Because really what's at stake, as much as Ed is saying, okay, we have used interfaces and it has to do with information flows, which is true. I don't think that my particular interfaces are what's at stake. I don't think what I spoke about is to show you my work alone. The issue is really much bigger. I think Neil's reaction also to the question of the virtual is really instructive. And I hope maybe Manuel and I will agree on this. I think the virtual is not virtual reality. It's something else. And it's really the question of the possibility that is imminent in the organization of the world, which means it's a very vast space that must be searched, that must be, within which rare things must be found, and the space exceeds human capacity. Can you hold this for a second, please, for me? Now, to make the point also about definitions, I did start with the definition specifically from architecture, specifically from Boulez. And I think Eric's questions were asking for definitions, but I think, in all honesty, he was missing the point. Manuel showed Carl Sims' creatures. I think he was quite precise and patient in the explanation. The fact is that I have the creatures evolving on my computer, and anyone who wants to see them can come see the code. The code is right here. You can write it. If you don't understand it, it might be your fault. If I don't understand it, it might be my fault. There is a change in tenor. There is a change in the times. The definitions are both more mobile and more precise. Now, everything that we just heard from both Ben and Bratton is completely true. But when the wheel hits the road, when it actually comes time to say, okay, let's compute something about the city, it will be computed in these terms. It will not be computed in the vocabulary or the rhetoric or the tenor of, let's say, assemblage or whatever it is that we read when we read it. Rhetoric is tired. It's necessary, it's important, it gives friction and resistance, but it needs to be embodied. The embodiment is not embodied necessarily in things. It's, as Manuel said, it's embodied in a metabolic system. It's embodied in a power balance. It's embodied in an ecosystem of variables that toss back and forth that you have to regulate. And, you know, I don't know, maybe I'm cursed, I apparently am, but I find this whole discussion with my infinite, apparently, patience, infinitely slow. What in the world is going on? I mean, these things were evident to me when I was an undergraduate. It's the same conversation, but you know what the terrifying thing is? I was reading this thing, can you hold this for a second, please? This is from Boulez. This is from 1776. It is the consideration of the discussion that occurred between Perrault, architect of the peristyle of the Louvre, and François Blondel, architect of the monument at the Porte de Saint-Denis. The present problem, says Boulez in 1776, is architecture merely fantastic art belonging to the realm of pure invention, or are its basic principles derived from nature? Allow me first to challenge the existence of any art form that is pure invention. If, by the strength of his mind and the techniques it devises, a man can arouse in us with his art those sensations which we experience when we look at nature, such art would be far superior to anything that we possess. For we are limited to more or less imperfect limitations. But there is no art that we can create alone. For if such art existed, it would mean that the divine being, the creator of nature, had endowed us with a quality that is part of his own essential being. And he goes on and on. They had this conversation 220 some years ago, 230 years ago. It is the conversation. It's the actual and the virtual. It's the edge of physicality. It's whether this is virtual and fictional. You know, in the meantime, we're on Mars. You know, I mean, these things are happening now. The cyborg isn't a fiction. It isn't romanticism. It is here. It is the drug you take, whoever takes it. You know, it is the mechanism that will replace your arm if you lose it. It's happening. What are you waiting for? That's my question. It's never too late to be early. That is quite clear. Thank you.
I guess we're going down the round, down through us, and then we'll go back out to the audience. But I'm sorry Eric left, because I think what he really wanted was he wanted us to tie some things together and to come up with a language, and I think we're really doing that. What's happening right now is we're at a new age. I mean, every age where the math changes, when we went from the world was flat to where the world was round, to where we're moving right now, to the nano and to the quantum, is telling us, is redefining what the world really is and the nature of who and what we are as beings on this planet. And it means that we have to redefine our vocabulary. We can't think in the same classical constructs as we typically did. We're going to be thinking with the wrong mathematical premises in order to keep up with where we're going with the future. So what I would have liked to have said to Eric is, we are giving the vocabulary, these very vocabularies. You're hearing the same terms come out of all of our mouths in different ways. You're hearing biogenerative material. You're hearing particle wave. You're hearing the physics, the mathematical constructs of being able to use materials both in the real world of matter and in the world of invisibility. Coming from music, it's all vibration. Does that mean it's not real because it's not material? I think not. I think not at all. It is real. It's a waveform. It's vibrating. It's just not condensed into matter. These are all realities. It isn't that matter is real and air is not real, or substance that you can't feel is not real. So we have to redefine the constructs that we're working with, and it takes coming up with a new math. I think Ben mentioned beauty and truth in the same word. To me now, that's what it is. Aesthetics is truth, and that's beauty. So that means getting the right mathematical constructs about it. It is objective. Anyway, that's all I say.
Should we pass this to the audience so that they can start asking some questions?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, for a question, I want to say how happy I am that I live in Southern California and I can come to know and listen presentations from some leading creative thinkers on this planet right now. And you guys are brilliant, we know that, and I don't think the panel needs to waste any more time apologizing to Eric, who doesn't know what he can go read Wikipedia and read an article about evolution, right? Or computation, or Turing. That's his problem, it's not our problem. And since I don't get my check from SCI-Arc, I can say whatever I want. Sorry. Anyway, so two questions. Okay, so question to Benjamin is that, I think we kind of metaphor the idea of city as a computer is a very powerful one, but I think it becomes more difficult to kind of start putting detail, start putting this idea in more detail. So the question would be, what is the difference between simply embedding networks and sensors and cameras and traditional computation in the city, which is already kind of happened, as opposed to truly imagining city as a computer, right? I mean, is there a difference? Because the example which you showed, those little blocks, right, from Center for Bits and Atoms from MIT, well, you basically have two small computers with sensors. So I'm not sure we really quite know yet, right, what the city as a computer is going to look like. Even my question to Manuel is that, of course, if I go right to a symposium like this, and Manuel De Landa is going to spend his talk time to talk about Carl Sims and genetic algorithms, obviously I know it's very important. My question is, why it is important to come back to this, right, and to bring this up and to focus on this today, because you could have focused on 100 other things, right? Since we're moving from Carl Sims you showed, I think it's around 1991, there was this little renaissance of work around artificial intelligence and genetic programming, and I personally haven't really seen, every time I give half a lecture about this topic, I still show the same Carl Sims movie, so I'm not sure what this, and I'm kind of wondering, this renaissance of artistic creativity, people doing amazing work, with these ideas didn't happen in 18 years, like I'm not sure I'm going to see. But obviously, for you, it's very important for students to start thinking about this right now. And I guess I'm wondering why this as opposed to something else at this moment. So this is, I have a first question, very brief, for the Santa Barbara team, which would be, it's a little unfair, but it's more fair than what happened before with Eric, right? So if we're going to have a magnetic instrument to try to discover or to try to look for the other beyond the other or the other in the other, etc., why do you guys want to fetishize with its form as a sphere, like the most canonical or archetypical kind of form, right? Why does this amazing telescope is going to look so traditional. I mean, I know very technical, right? Technical answers, you know, it wasn't really built by you, right? It's like the whole sort of VR and cave tradition, but maybe we can give a kind of philosophical kind of, you know, response to this question. So a few things.
Who you want to speak first?
Well, maybe.
We could probably answer the sphere question quickly.
Well, maybe it's because I think it was, I mean, whoever showed more animations of the sphere, right? Probably responsible.
So, I don't.
You keep it so that you pass it on.
Yeah, and I can speak really quickly. I can tell you why we did. I think you're asking me why a sphere instead of a cube, or why that shape? Is that what you're asking?
Well, the thing is, I think I know why it's a sphere, but I think like you know, in presentations, you know, like there was all these connections made in the sphere, you know, in the images of the sphere, SCI-Arc and culture, saying, okay, it fits within this tradition, but then maybe we should emphasize the sphere as something unusual. What is the instrument that going to look, you know, that we use to look with other beyond the other is going to look like something human can be constructed for thousands of years.
Well, I mean, the reason why it was constructed that way was because of the planet that we live on. And so we were trying to make a space where we could simulate reality and work in the same kind of way that we actually view the world. I mean, we live on a ball, we don't live on a cube, we look to the horizon, we look for immersion. This is why that particular design, but the design isn't supposed to mimic a sphere or always build a world. The interesting thing about the way the building was built was it's super black, the screens are super black, so when you're in there it's complete sensory deprivation, so it's actually, you're in a space that's really non-existent. You're in a echo-free chamber and in a dark space that should allow you to really simulate anything. So thinking of it as a world builder or an instrument that could be played or performed. I don't know if I'm answering your question. Okay, good.
Okay, I think we're going to take one last question, but I fear you have to come up here and take this mic. I think we have a...
Can I just say something?
Oh, it doesn't work again?
Can I just say
Does it work?
Hey.
He wants to say one thing.
I just want to say something that has not been clarified so far. You know, first of all, the question about why Carl Sims right now is because when Carl Sims did what he did, he had to actually have access to a supercomputer, to some huge, a very exclusive kind of place. So today, everybody has a supercomputer in their desktop. So it is today that this thing is about to take off. But let me just add one more thing, because which has to do with your question to Benjamin. You know, when you look at, say, the Egyptian building of the pyramids, or when you look at Louis XIV and Colbert building of Versailles, or when you look, in fact, at the logistics of any city in history, you can see immediately in what sense we're talking, perhaps not of a computer, but of an information processing system. It is impossible to have a city in which you actually can control the flow of water into the city, guarantee your citizens they will be drinking water, control who comes to the market and where, in what stall they are, how they are distributing the stalls in the marketplace with their grains and their manufactured goods and so on. Let alone build a city or build the pyramids with a lot of information processing. And with very specialized people. When you analyze the hierarchies in the Egyptian government in the third dynasty, how they built a fantastic, the tallest pyramid of all has about 2 million blocks each one, of which is above 12 tons each. You can imagine the logistics of transporting those materials, of organizing the transport so they would not conflict with the actual already positioning them. All of that is information processing. All of that is information processing. So it is not a metaphor in the least. When what's his name was completely flabbergasted by, I don't understand how this could possibly be. It was like, well, because you don't understand anything, man. Because you know, that is precisely the mentality of the 80s and the 90s when you believe in Derrida, when you believe that all systems are gone. All we can do now is self-denial and go to the meta level and do some self-criticism. It has to be constant self-criticism. That is gone. That is yesterday's news. Nobody believes in that crap anymore. Thank you for whomever clapped over there. I know it was a friend of mine. And of course, I just lost my job here, but what the hell?
There's a question back.
I have a question. Can I have the Santa Barbara instrument, the image, if it's possible?
Do you have one?
Can we see on the screen the Santa Barbara instrument?
The Alistair?
If we have it.
Yeah, no problem.
Well, that's coming up. Let me just quickly say what Manuel said. It's again, yes, it's exactly right. It's not that computation is a metaphor within a city or something that we applied upon it. But I also would want to sort of underscore that that doesn't in itself save us from anything. Precisely for that reason, our cities are utterly broken. We can barely feed ourselves. We can't move from one side of the city to the other. We don't know where our water's coming from in the next 25 years. We put hundreds of thousands of millions of our people in prisons, building a big concrete wall along our southern border. It's not that we can't compute better answers to these problems. Computation in and of itself isn't going to be the thing that allows us to calculate our way out of these problems.
Well, because there are limits of complexity, right? Our cities now have grown beyond sizes that are exceeding our capacities of processing information in a timely fashion. Also we are exhausting resources.
I think
it's not information.
I agree with you, but I think it's also that our institutional mechanisms for, let's say, for organizing that calculation in any sort of ways are
that's true too.
Inadequate to where it needs to be. So so again, it's from this top down to bottom up model. We need to.
Well, when the judge that was presiding over the case of Microsoft, when the antitrust case of Microsoft, when the judge had to be explained what an operating system was, right? that immediately shows you that the speed at which institutions are evolving is way slower than the way.
So we need to bypass them, and I think that's the issue. What are those political institutions that will secede, will come after the ones that we have? And I think that's what we need to be early about.
That is an important point.
Could we hear that last question, please?
Yeah, sorry.
We're running out of time.
It's a problem. It's a problem of what we want to do with it. If we don't have the will, and we've advocated on the public good, then there won't be anything. That's separate. It's a totally valid question, totally important, but not really a question for our computers. It's for us to decide.
I think it's a question of what we do with computation per se, because I think that's the meta technology with which whatever we're going to do, we're going to do it. How we institutionalize that capacity is the only question.
Stefan, do you have a question?
Yes. First of all, I appreciate your work. And so I'm trying to locate myself. And the question was who was the architect or designer of the Santa Barbara instrument? That was important for me to locate myself in this symposium. And I see two sets of obligations. One is the obligation to design the instrument, and one is the obligation to explore the instrument. And I saw this symposium more as exploration of the instrument. And I feel for me in SCI-Arc, I have to basically decide my stand. And I see it with my other students, I discuss with other students, somehow we have to make that decision. And that is becoming harder and harder. And I came to this symposium basically as someone who studied architecture, to basically locate myself. And this helps me a lot to understand, because I see architect is the person who relates that exploration to the instrument. I see architect that, but not necessarily the exploration of the subject.
I'm the designer of the instrument, and I'm not an architect, I'm a composer. And I believe that design, although I have been designing media studios and systems for about 24 years, but I think that you can't at this point really separate content from the design of the system. And I think that this is one of the things I think that Eric, needs to hear. It's a time of change. We can't approach the disciplines as disciplines anymore. Most disciplines, architecture, music, art, have hundreds of years of discipline behind them. We're starting a new field now. The field is telling us right now, especially with the work that we're seeing with biogenerative growth, that we can work at the subatomic level, which means that structures don't need to be made with nails and hammers anymore, with you thinking of the function in mind, saying it's going to function like this, but now the structure is built, and when the function changes, I have to go in and rebuild the structure. We can actually start thinking from the ground floor up of building the structure according to the function, which makes the job for all of you much harder than it was for us in our time. You're truly multimodal individuals. You're young, you're on the brink of discovery in ways that more discipline-specific people aren't. So, my question for you, fortunately or unfortunately, is I think you have to embrace both sides and try to understand not only how it's built and then say it's built so someone's going to use it, but the usability of it and then how you can actually change the building because of the usability.
I think it's a really good question, but I think it's placed slightly incorrectly, if I may say so. And here's why. Imagine I mentioned Galileo. We could ask who designed the first telescope. There's a person. We also know that Galileo designed his own first telescope. We can also, we also know that it was a very narrow field of view, and he couldn't even look at the whole moon at once or a whole star at once. So, but what Galileo saw and who designed the instrument is really not the question, which is what you're asking. The question is what's out there. That's the question. Same thing with the violin. Someone designed the first violin. Someone designed the best violin. We know Stradivarius is really, the best of the best. There are violinists. Some of them are the best of the best. But the real question is, what music does it enable? Not, who's your favorite violinist? How many records do they sell? Who made this piece of wood so wonderful? That's, I think, the part that preoccupies me. What has opened into the world? The world is out there. We can see a bit more of it. What can we find? That would be the question I would give to you.
One quick question.
Okay, we'll have to wrap. One more question.
I did basically what I
What's the rush?
No, we're going to use the reception.
There's a reception. There's a reception.
This idea of
We'll stay.
the narrative or the
Sorry, could you repeat that?
this idea of the narrative or the monograph architect, I think is really something that kind of becomes almost like a conflict because you have to, like you say, position yourself. And I find this really interesting in this topic because I was listening to all these people and I've heard all of them speak before in some way or another. And particularly for you, for Marcus, Paul Solari and the way that came about, the drawings and the evolution of the buildings and then some of the terminology which is now used in computer technology and nano architecture, nanotechnology, all these things that he was conceiving of from a different point of view. So I find it strange that sometimes, once attacked, everyone tries to go back into a narrative because we know people who weren't following this idea of, let's say, oh, we have this tool and now we're going to go into this virtual world, now we're going to kind of make it into the new real and materialize it. When you have a guy who's actually conceptualizing things that evolved from a different place, he actually evolved those concepts before they existed.
Well, that's the whole idea. We've got to get out of thinking about the tool, the technology. It's all here. It all deals with the content that we're developing. It isn't about the technology at all.
But particularly this narrative, and each day if you listen to, particularly Bloomberg, right, they tell you what the real story is, and then by the end of the day, it's been ripped apart, and they get to the next day and they have to tell you now what the real story is. And it's in the past, it seemed like that could last 10 years before you had to change your narrative. Now the narrative has to change overnight, and that dysfunction has created to the point where the SEC says to Congress that they don't know what their job is, even though they've had it for quite a long time. And when you get to the point of architecture, you have the same thing. You have like stacks of monographs of people, and now you're questioning like, okay, well, if it's moving at the speed of what we're hearing from all the people on stage, and how quickly you have to engage into this in order to be a part of it, or particularly to think like, someone like Paul Solari, you really have to like drop a lot of baggage.
Architects aren't architecture.
Hang on a second, guys. Apparently there's a reception right now at 5. Where is it? It's right around the corner. Right around the corner here?
The discussion next door. Could I just make one comment? Not a question, but I don't think that there's any inability to define terms among you, but what I see happening is the whole symposium was structured to an inappropriate amount of time. You should have gone for 4 or even 8 hours and invited more people and done your whole presentation. And I'm so glad to hear people thinking about what's really going on in the urban environment too. Like your last impromptu conversation. I mean, thank you for thinking about it. So, and thank you.
So at the reception, let's okay. So thank you for your talks. I wrote down my question. So today we have a tremendous amount of knowledge. We have the ability to simulate and to predict. The scientific method has taken us very quickly to where we are today. But what seems to still be the challenge is creating wisdom or creating a civilization. I don't think that science can remain our Switzerland. I think it's cracking. So where do we gather, and how do we come to agree about what our resources are, what our sustenance is or should be? I think the interface between artists and designers is critical. I think trust is critical. So my question is very simply, how do we build trust?
One of the observations that I would make is basically we see a model that's being championed these days by, for example, Chris Anderson's editorial piece in Wired last year, focusing on the end of science. At the end of science also, the end of science, the end of theory.
I could answer that.
And one of the arguments that he's making in this article is essentially to say that we don't need to have models any longer because models have always failed us. So let's just accumulate data and start running analysis on the data because we'll discover something from the data that the model wouldn't have been able to predict. On a very tangential level, this is connected to some of the issues that Manuel was bringing up in terms of understanding what the parameters of evolution are. But of course, it's also a position that's based from a platform that has models and blind spots built into it. So, and many of the comments that were posted on Wired after he wrote that piece and published it addressed that particular issue. And Ben, in fact, I think, and Manuel are much more adequately equipped to address the history of science and the philosophy of science than I am in response to your point. I think it's an important point. For me, one of the only key issues that came up in the discussion today, one of the themes I would reduce it to, would be that there are models that we haven't had adequate access to in the past that we now do have access to in terms of everyday computation. And those computations, this doesn't mean able to solve our problems, as Ben pointed out. It simply means that things we could not do 5 or 10 years ago, we can, each and every one of us now do, which will radically change the way that we distribute information production, parsing, gathering, and the production of meaning. That's one paradigm shift that I consider to be radically important, fundamentally important. That doesn't, though, solve the question that you raised. It merely resituates the question in a different way. And if we lose sight of the issue that you raised, depending depending on the point that Anderson makes in his article in Wired, I think we lose the context that we can answer that question from. So I hope that kind of tangentially addresses what you brought up.
I just want to clarify. Now, your question was trust between artist and scientist, or?
No, just how do we create civilization and wisdom versus just knowledge?
Well, you know, actually that's a very important question that you're asking, because knowledge without wisdom is power, and it can be very corrupting, it can be very evil. I believe that there has to be a very strong balance between wisdom and knowledge, and one of the things that's really interesting for us at Santa Barbara is that for the past 20 years we've been working together as scientists, artists, and engineers, and for the past 12 years I've been having a really close dialogue, a daily basis, hours dialogue with my scientist colleagues that are really looking a lot at the knowledge base of the thing and not really looking at the perceptual awareness of things. And as we start talking with artists, with the scientists, and the technical and the perceptive start to come together, some of the questions that we're asking one another aren't really hitting on to these very important issues of not even can we do something, but should we? Is it ethical to do that? What is the benefit of doing that? These are questions that we're seriously asking. One of the reasons why, and I'm in that building as an artist, because I feel for the first time in my life, the question has been called. And they've asked the artists. Nobel laureates, Fields Medal winners have actually asked us, they want to know. And this is the time that we cannot deny that conversation. We have to be there, even if it means sacrificing some of our own world, because we make decisions as artists. We want to go out, we want to create. And no, I want to do that next commission, but how many commissions have I given up to have this dialogue now? I think that there's a time. We have a goal, a duty as artists in mind, to step into what I call the mouth, into the fire, and elevate our stature at the same level as scientists and engineers. When the government is saying we need to elevate the educational system of our students, of artists, scientists, and engineers, then we know that we won. So I don't know if that answers or gives an idea.
Could we please continue the conversation?